It was the winter of 1944, and the heart of Europe was dying. The Battle of Budapest, the last great siege of the Eastern Front, was a confrontation that consumed an entire city, a final act of desperation in a war already drowning in blood. For 102 days, from December 1944 to February 1945, the Hungarian capital became a fortress, a trapped island of fire and ruin, where the German Wehrmacht and their Hungarian allies faced the full, crushing weight of the Soviet Red Army. The streets of Budapest became trenches. The Danube ran black with oil and red with blood, and the beautiful city, once called the Pearl of the Danube, was turned into a tomb. By the time the siege ended, nearly 200,000 soldiers were dead or captured, and the city itself, its palaces, bridges, and cathedrals, lay in ruins. The Battle of Budapest was not just a siege, it was the death rattle of the Axis dream in the East, a final echo of defiance that ended in silence. In the autumn of 1944, Hungary stood at the crossroads of ruin. Once Germany's ally, its leaders were now desperate to escape the war's inevitable end. Regent Miklos Hervey had secretly opened negotiations with the Allies, hoping to spare his nation from total destruction. But Hitler knew, in a swift and ruthless move, the Germans launched Operation Panzerfaust, seized Budapest, and installed a puppet regime, the fascist Arrow Cross Party, under Ferenc Szalasi. The city became a fortress, its people hostages to ideology and vengeance. As the Red Army closed in from the east, Hitler declared Budapest a fortress city, Festung Budapest, to be held at all costs. No retreat, no surrender. The defenders, numbering around 70,000 Germans and Hungarians, dug in among the grand avenues and medieval streets, turning every building, every bridge, every basement into a stronghold. In December, the Soviet 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts, commanded by Rodion Malinovsky and Fyodor Tolbukin, began their encirclement. By Christmas, Budapest was surrounded, cut off from the outside world. Inside the city, over 800,000 civilians were trapped, huddled in cellars as shells screamed overhead. Food vanished, power failed, and the bitter cold turned water to ice. The defenders, led by General Karl Pfeffer Wildenbruch, were ordered by Hitler to resist to the last man. The Soviets demanded surrender, the Germans refused. Thus began one of the most brutal urban battles of the war. The fighting was relentless, street by street, floor by floor, room by room. Each building became a fortress, each courtyard a battlefield. Soviet tanks clattered over cobblestones slick with blood, only to be ambushed by German Panzerfausts, hiding in basements. The Buda Hills echoed with artillery, snipers stalked the streets, and civilians were caught in the crossfire. The Soviets advanced slowly, paying for every block with lives. Hospitals overflowed, corpses froze where they fell. In the sewers beneath the city, soldiers crawled through filth and darkness to launch surprise attacks, their footsteps echoing beneath the ruins. The once beautiful city of art and music had become a maze of death. By January, the situation inside Budapest had become desperate. Ammunition was low, food nearly gone, civilians ate horses, then dogs, then whatever could be found. The Danube, once the city's lifeline, had become a front line. The Soviets destroyed the bridges one by one, cutting Buda from Pest. Still, the defenders held on. Hitler's orders were absolute. Budapest must not fall. But the Red Army's grip tightened. The encirclement closed like a fist. Every attempt to break through failed. Columns of tanks were destroyed in open fields. Relief, forces were annihilated in snow and mud. Inside the city, morale collapsed, discipline faltered, and death became routine. In mid-February, the end came. On the night of February 11th, 1945, in one last desperate act, 30,000 German and Hungarian soldiers attempted to break out of the city. Under cover of darkness and snow, they stormed through Soviet lines, hoping to reach the open countryside. Fewer than 700 made it, the rest were killed or captured. When Soviet troops entered the Buda Castle district days later, they found only ruins and silence. General Pfeffer-Waldenbruch surrendered. The siege of Budapest was over. What remained of the city was unrecognizable. Entire districts leveled, thousands of civilians dead, and every bridge across the Danube destroyed. The once glittering capital of Central Europe had been reduced to ash and rubble. The aftermath was catastrophic. The city's population had been decimated. Mass executions and atrocities committed by both sides left scars that would never heal. For Hungary, the fall of Budapest marked the end of its alliance with Germany and the beginning of Soviet domination, a shift from one tyranny to another. For Germany, it was a death blow on the Eastern Front, signaling that the Reich's time was over. The Battle of Budapest was the Eastern Front's final tragedy, a miniature Stalingrad in Central Europe, fought with the same desperation, the same sacrifice, and the same futility. Today, Budapest stands rebuilt, its bridges gleaming once more, its streets alive with laughter. But beneath its foundations lies a graveyard, the bones of soldiers and civilians entombed in silence. The siege of Budapest was more than a battle. It was a crucible of humanity, where bravery and brutality walked hand in hand, and where the price of fanaticism was paid in full. Tonight we return to those frozen streets and shattered palaces, to the last siege of the Eastern Front, where the war's dying flame burned with one final, merciless brightness. This is the entire story of the Battle of Budapest, when the pearl of the Danube became a fortress of despair and a city's soul was buried beneath the snow. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you tonight? Budapest, in the early 1940s, was a city of light and elegance, stretched along the bends of the Danube like a jewel in Europe's crown. Its grand boulevards carried the echo of footsteps on cobblestones, polished by centuries of history. Bridges linked Buda's quiet hills to Pest's restless avenues, uniting two halves into a single beating heart. Cafes brimmed with conversation, laughter, and the scent of roasted coffee drifting into the evening air. The Parliament building rose above the river, stately and immovable, a reminder of Hungary's place in the tapestry of nations. Musicians played in courtyards, their melodies drifting like threads of silk on the night air. Families strolled under lamps that cast golden reflections upon the flowing water. The Danube, wide and slow, seemed eternal, carrying stories both ancient and modern beneath its surface. To many, the city appeared timeless, untouched by the chaos of war spreading across Europe. Yet even in stillness, there was a faint awareness of something drawing nearer, like distant thunder. And so the rhythm of life moved forward, gently unaware of the shadows forming beyond the horizon. Hungary, by this time, stood at a delicate crossroads between alliances and survival. The government had aligned itself with Germany, seeking to recover lands lost after the First World War. Many citizens felt pride in the nation's rebirth, even as unease whispered through private conversations. Soldiers in uniform marched down familiar streets, yet the city still clung to its normal rhythms of markets, music, and festivals. Mothers carried bread from the bakeries, while schoolchildren laughed on their way home. Few imagined that their daily paths would soon be interrupted by war. The city's buildings, with their proud facades, seemed eternal guardians of peace. But time, steady as the Danube, does not pause, and history's current was already shifting. The old ways lingered like the last notes of a song, sweet but fading. The days still seemed bright, though a long shadow was slowly stretching across them. The Danube was always more than a river to the people of Budapest. It was a companion, a boundary, and a lifeline. Its waters mirrored the spires, domes, and bridges, doubling their beauty in rippling reflections. Fishermen cast their lines, and barges moved silently past, carrying goods between nations. Children leaned over railings to watch the water flow, laughing as they dropped leaves into the current. Lovers walked its banks at sunset, their voices blending with the wind. For centuries the river had carried traders, armies, and poets, bearing witness to Hungary's triumphs and defeats. Now, as winter approached in 1944, it flowed as gently as ever, concealing the silent movements of destiny. Few could guess that soon the river would be filled not with laughter, but with the heavy silence of struggle. For the moment, its calm was unbroken, its song unchanged. To watch it then was to believe that peace might last forever. Yet even rivers carry unseen currents, moving quietly toward storms not yet visible on the surface. The bridges stood like guardians of the city's unity, graceful arcs of stone and steel linking east and west. The Chain Bridge, oldest and most beloved, gleamed with lamps that seemed to float above the water. Each bridge was not only a passage, but a symbol of connection between neighborhoods, histories, and destinies. In the evenings, couples lingered on their walkways, gazing at the shimmering city lights. Horse-drawn carts rattled across in daylight, sharing space with automobiles and bicycles. No one paused to think that one day these lifelines would become targets, or that their graceful spans might tumble into the waters they crossed. For now they were steady, familiar, and enduring, like the heartbeat of the city itself. Beneath their arches, the river whispered in tones older than nations. Above them, the stars cast silver trails, eternal against the dark sky. The people moved beneath those stars, unaware of how swiftly they would be pulled into the currents of history. And so the bridges stood, waiting, unaware of the weight they would soon be asked to bear. In neighborhoods across Budapest, the rhythm of daily life continued with stubborn steadiness. Shopkeepers opened their shutters at dawn, filling stalls with fruits, vegetables, and spices. Tailors bent over fabric, while students hurried to classrooms with satchels slung across their shoulders. Streetcars rang their bells and trundled down wide avenues lined with linden trees. The smells of bread, paprika, and roasting meat filled narrow alleys. Families sat together at long tables, lighting candles and saying prayers in the quiet of evening. Even as rumors of war drifted in, people clung to routines that gave them comfort. The resilience of ordinary life seemed unshakable, like roots growing deep in the soil. Yet just beneath the surface, small changes hinted at the future. Soldiers on leave mixing with civilians, posters calling for vigilance, whispers of shortages. The city lived on, while faint signs of change slipped quietly into the margins of everyday life. Hungary's leadership, bound by alliance, had already placed the nation on a perilous course. German influence reached deep into government decisions, and with it came the steady tightening of military presence. Though Budapest itself was still untouched, the war's front lines were drawing steadily nearer. Soldiers spoke of battles in Poland and Romania, of vast Soviet armies pressing forward. The words were quiet, often spoken in bars or whispered across tables. For those who listened carefully, unease stirred like a cold wind through the city. Yet the Danube still glittered, the cafes still sang, and the trams still rang. Life and war existed side by side, the former refusing to yield until the latter became impossible to ignore. It was a fragile balance, like glass resting on the edge of a table. And slowly, that balance tilted toward the fall. Autumn turned to winter, and the air grew sharp, carrying the scent of smoke from countless chimneys. Snow settled on rooftops, softening the edges of stone and iron. Children made paths through drifts, leaving trails that curved through courtyards and squares. The beauty of the season hid the deepening storm that approached from the east. Families celebrated holidays, determined to keep joy alive in uncertain times. Candles glowed in windows, their small flames defiant against the dark. To those within, the city seemed unchanged, filled with the same comforts and traditions. Yet beyond the city, the lines of war were tightening, each day drawing closer to Budapest's gates. The calm of the season was precious, fragile, and fleeting. Winter's silence would soon be broken, and with it the illusion of distance from war. Budapest in 1944 was a city living in two worlds, one of timeless beauty and one of impending storm. Its river flowed in calm majesty, its bridges gleamed with light, its people carried on with rituals of life, yet the shadow of war had already begun to stretch across its streets, long and unavoidable. Each day of peace was a borrowed gift, measured against an approaching tide. Though no one could yet see the full shape of the future, the signs of change were unmistakable. The Danube had carried centuries of history, and it would soon carry yet another burden. The city's heartbeat, steady and proud, was about to quicken into survival. Still, in these final days before the siege, Budapest shimmered with a beauty untouched. The night sky glowed above the river, reflecting a peace more fragile than anyone knew. The Danube shimmered in peace, but its waters were already carrying the whispers of war downstream. By the autumn of 1944, the eastern horizon was no longer distant for the people of Hungary. The Red Army had crossed the Carpathians, pushing through Transylvania and the Hungarian plain with quiet determination. Villagers heard the distant thunder of artillery before they saw the first soldiers, and the land seemed to hold its breath. The Germans, once masters of the region, were now retreating step by step, carrying with them only fragments of an empire. For Hungary, the war had become a burden too heavy to balance, tied to Germany, yet fearful of the Soviet tide. Rumors drifted into Budapest of whole armies, dissolving under pressure, their banners lowered in silence. Farmers spoke of long columns of refugees moving westward, their wagons creaking under meager belongings. Each day the front moved closer, a slow tide advancing over fields and towns. Though Budapest still glowed with its lights, the darkness on the horizon deepened. The sense of distance between the city and the war began to dissolve, replaced by the quiet certainty of its approach. Hungary's leaders had walked a dangerous path, shifting alliances like pieces on a chessboard. Regent Miklos Hardy, sensing Germany's decline, had secretly sought to negotiate with the Allies. Yet the attempt faltered, and German forces moved swiftly to tighten their grip on Budapest. The Arrow Cross Party, allied with Berlin, seized power, bringing with them a harsher hand and darker days. Under their rule, the city's sense of safety began to fray, and whispers turned into silences heavy with fear. At the same time, Germany declared Budapest a fortress, to be held at any cost, a jewel they could not afford to lose. For the people, it meant that their city, once celebrated for its beauty, was now condemned to become a battleground. Choices that belonged to distant rulers now fell upon the lives of ordinary families, even as trams rattled down their routes, and cafes filled with conversation. The ground beneath them shifted. The city was caught between loyalty and survival, both paths leading into shadows. To the east, the Soviet armies pressed on with relentless patience, their progress measured not in hours but in miles of earth reclaimed. They moved across the great Hungarian plain, where wind swept low over fields, carrying the distant sound of movement like a murmur in the grass. Town by town, crossroads by crossroads, their presence grew nearer. Villagers who had once welcomed German troops with caution now watched another army arrive, wondering what future these soldiers carried. Horses left deep prints in the mud, and supply carts groaned under the weight of their burdens. For the Soviets, Budapest was more than a city. It was the gateway to Vienna, to the Danube Valley, and to the heart of Central Europe. Each mile forward brought them closer to the bridges, the parliament, and the proud hills of Buda. The soldiers marched with a sense of momentum, driven by both command and inevitability. The war, once far away, was now walking steadily toward the capital. The horizon no longer seemed safe, for the tide of war was flowing with unbroken force. Within Budapest, the change was subtle at first, a shift in tone rather than in sight. Posters urged vigilance, and speeches promised strength. But in quiet corners people whispered of uncertainty. Bread grew scarcer, fuel harder to find, and ration lines longer with each passing week. At night families spoke softly about what they had heard, lowering their voices even in their own homes. Some prayed for German protection, others for Soviet deliverance, and many only wished to survive whatever came. Children continued their studies, but their books seemed fragile against the weight of unfolding history. The parliament still stood, proud and lit, but its power was brittle, bound by forces far beyond its walls. Each day, the atmosphere grew heavier, as though the air itself carried the weight of decision. Beneath the surface, everyone knew that the city's fate was no longer in its own hands. Budapest was slowly becoming less a home and more a prize in the eyes of others. For Germany, the loss of Hungary would mean the collapse of their last defences in the southeast. Oil from the fields of Hungary and Romania had fueled their war, and the Danube offered vital passage for supplies. Without Budapest, Vienna itself would be vulnerable, and the heart of the Reich exposed. Thus the order was given to defend the city at all costs, to turn its streets into walls and its houses into shields. German troops marched in, their boots striking against stones that had known centuries of quieter footsteps. Civilians watched in silence, knowing the presence of soldiers meant the nearness of battle. The bridges over the Danube were studied not for their beauty, but for their strength. Bunkers were prepared, defences planned, the map of the city redrawn with lines of resistance. What had been a capital of culture was now being prepared as a fortress of war. And in that transformation, the city's heart began to change, even as its walls hardened. The Soviet advance carried with it not only soldiers but also the weight of vengeance and memory. They had suffered immense losses in the war, and each step westward was a step of retribution. The people of Hungary, once allies of Germany, could not know how they would be treated when the armies arrived. Some hoped for mercy, others braced for hardship, but all felt the uncertainty like a stone in the chest. Refugees streamed through the countryside, their quiet processions filling roads with wagons and weary feet. Stories traveled faster than armies, carried by word of mouth, feeding both hope and dread. In Budapest, the movement of these people was a warning as clear as any official message. The city's beauty and calm could not erase the knowledge that the front was drawing closer each hour. A sense of waiting filled the air, like a room holding its breath before a storm. The approach of the Red Army was not only military, it was the weight of history itself drawing near. Winter settled over Hungary, and the cold air carried both silence and unease. Snow fell softly, muffling the sounds of the city, yet underneath lay tension sharper than any frost. German soldiers dug trenches at the city's edge, while Hungarian units were pressed into new defences. Families stocked what food they could, uncertain how long it might have to last. The markets, once filled with abundance, showed shelves increasingly bare. At night, the glow of lamps seemed weaker, as if the very light was growing cautious. Neighbours exchanged fewer words, each absorbed by private fears they could not share openly. In the Parliament, decisions grew heavier, though the choices themselves had narrowed to almost nothing. All paths led to the same truth: the city would not escape what was coming. The quiet of winter was no longer peace. It was only the pause before the storm. And so Budapest, still shining along the Danube, found itself caught in the slow tightening of history's grip. To the east the Soviets advanced, determined and unyielding. To the west, Germany pressed the city into service, refusing to let it slip away. Between them stood the people, their homes, their lives, their fragile moments of normalcy. The lights along the bridges still glittered on the water, but their glow seemed different now, more fragile, more uncertain. The city that had once been a gathering place of culture was becoming the prize of two collapsing empires. Each day the weight of that truth settled more heavily upon its streets. Budapest was no longer merely a place of beauty, it was a fortress in waiting, and the people who lived there could sense that their world was quietly changing. The city was no longer just a home, it was becoming a fortress caught between collapsing empires. In the late months of 1944, the voice of command from Berlin fell heavily upon Budapest. Adolf Hitler declared that the Hungarian capital would be held at all costs, transformed into a fortress city. To him, its bridges, hills, and parliament were not only symbols but strategic treasures, the last shield before Vienna. The order left no room for retreat, no space for compromise, and no consideration for the lives within its walls. German generals understood the burden, yet they bowed to the command, knowing refusal was unthinkable. Hungarian leaders, bound to Germany by circumstance and pressure, accepted the fate with silence more than enthusiasm. For the people of Budapest, the words were distant at first, spoken in offices and barracks, yet those words carried weight, and soon their meaning settled like frost across every street. The city was no longer free to be itself, it had been claimed as a fortress, and from that moment, its destiny shifted from one of life to one of endurance. To turn Budapest into a fortress meant reshaping its body and soul. Engineers marked key bridges for demolition should the enemy approach, and soldiers mapped streets for lines of fire. Barricades began to rise, built from paving stones and rails torn from tramlines. Buildings were reinforced, windows sealed with sandbags, and houses transformed into defensive strongpoints. Ancient cellars, once used for storing wine or food, became command posts and shelters. On the hills of Buda, artillery was stationed, pointed eastward toward the invisible approach of the Red Army. The wide avenues of Pest, once symbols of modernity, were redrawn in military plans as killing grounds and choke points. Every corner of the city began to take on a double meaning, beauty layered with danger. Civilians watched the changes with uneasy silence, their familiar streets becoming strange before their eyes. The ordinary fabric of life was slowly rewoven into the cold cloth of war. For the people, these transformations were both visible and hidden. At first, it was the sound of footsteps heavier than usual, boots echoing against stones where lighter shoes once passed. Then it was the sight of soldiers carrying coils of wire, crates of ammunition, and shovels for digging trenches. Children who once played near fountains now stood watching men fortify the very walls of their neighborhoods. Conversations grew shorter, voices lowered, as uncertainty hung like mist in the air. Shops remained open, but the faces behind the counters carried lines of worry. Market squares, once lively with chatter, now shared space with barracks and convoys. The scent of roasted chestnuts mixed with the harsh odor of fuel and steel. Familiar melodies drifted faintly from radios, but even music sounded altered, stretched thin against the growing unease. What had once been a city of comfort was turning into a city of preparation. German troops settled into Budapest in greater numbers, blending uneasily with Hungarian forces. Though allies in name, there was little warmth between them, only necessity binding their fate. The Germans viewed the city as a stronghold to be exploited, while Hungarians saw it as their home to be defended or endured. Orders came from German command, but the labor often fell upon local shoulders. Bridges were loaded with explosives, and rumors spread quickly about their fate. Families whispered of leaving, but many stayed, either by choice or by lack of means. In cafes, talk turned to whether the Soviets might show mercy, though no one could say for certain. Some prayed for deliverance, others feared it, and all felt the weight of decisions beyond their control. Each day, the city slipped further from its own hands. Budapest was no longer only Hungarian. It had become a piece on a larger chessboard. The very architecture of Budapest lent itself to defense. The hills of Buda offered commanding views over the river, and ancient fortresses rose above its skyline. Pest, with its flat streets and grand boulevards, provided wide avenues that could be blocked or mined. The bridges across the Danube became lifelines, both strategic and symbolic, binding the halves of the city together. German planners admired the natural strength of the terrain, believing it could resist the Soviet tide for weeks, perhaps months. Yet such admiration came with cold calculation, blind to the lives interwoven within the stones. Civilians were caught within the geometry of defense, their homes marked as strongpoints, their churches as observation posts. The city's history, culture, and beauty were all subordinated to military necessity. For those who lived there, it was a strange inversion of meaning. The very strengths that once defined Budapest as a capital now sealed its fate as a fortress. As preparations deepened, the atmosphere of the city changed in tone. Once Budapest had been known for its music, its laughter, its golden evenings along the Danube. Now it was known for the hammering of nails, the clatter of stone, and the heavy silence of waiting. Soldiers dug trenches in public gardens, their shovels cutting into earth that had once nourished flowers. Statues stood witness as sandbags piled high at their bases, their noble figures draped in shadow. Bells that had called to prayer now echoed across streets where troops moved in measured rhythm. Each small act of defense became another reminder that peace was vanishing. The city was still alive, but it was alive in a different way, tense and guarded. In its silence, one could almost hear the turning of history's wheel. The sound of everyday life had shifted into the quiet hum of preparation. For civilians, the fortress declaration meant more than military plans. It meant an end to escape. Trains grew fewer, roads closed, and the city became a cage of stone and river. Families who once dreamed of waiting out the war in the countryside now found themselves sealed within the capital. The walls of their homes felt closer, the streets narrower, and the river less a friend than a boundary. Supplies grew harder to find, and rationing deepened the sense of constraint. The Danube, still flowing silently, seemed indifferent to the human struggle above. For many, faith became a quiet refuge. Prayers whispered in cellars and chapels. Others turned to silence, watching events unfold with weary eyes. Everyone understood, though few spoke it aloud, that Budapest would not be spared. The walls of the fortress were closing in, and with them came the certainty of struggle. Thus, by the close of 1944, Budapest was no longer only a city of light, bridges, and history. It was a declared fortress, marked by orders far away, reshaped by soldiers close at hand. Its streets bore new meanings, its squares carried new burdens, and its people felt the weight of being chosen as a battleground. The beauty of its architecture, the pride of its culture, the life of its neighborhoods, all had been overshadowed by the iron needs of war. In the stillness of night, the lamps still glowed softly, but their warmth seemed thinner now. The city's heart was steady, yet its pulse had quickened with anticipation. Peace had not yet broken, but its edges were already fraying. Each bridge, each tower, each street corner stood ready, as if bracing against unseen pressure. The fortress was built not of stone alone, but of expectation and inevitability. Streets once filled with laughter became corridors of stone, bracing for a storm. In December 1944, the horizon around Budapest began to darken with movement. Soviet forces, advancing from the east and south, spread like a slow tide across the plains of Hungary. Their aim was not only to take the city but to surround it, sealing it off from relief and supply. Step by step, village by village, the Red Army drew a ring that would soon close. The Danube, with its sweeping bends, gave shape to the battlefield, channeling armies into positions of pressure. German and Hungarian troops inside the capital could watch the news unfold from maps, but the civilians felt it in the silences between rumors. The countryside beyond the city grew distant, no longer reachable, no longer a refuge. The voices of those returning from the outskirts spoke of roads cut and railways broken. The circle was not yet complete, but its shadow could already be felt. And in that shadow, the city began to sense the narrowing of its fate. On Christmas Eve, the encirclement became reality. Soviet units joined hands across the western approaches, closing the last road into Budapest. The German garrison within the city found itself cut off, an island of resistance, in a river of advancing power. The order from Berlin was clear. Budapest must be held, no matter the cost. The soldiers braced themselves, but the civilians began to understand what this meant. Escape was no longer possible, save by flight across the icy river or through perilous gaps that quickly vanished. Families who had delayed decisions to leave found themselves bound to the city by circumstance. The lights of the countryside, once familiar, were now gone, replaced by the dim glow of distant fires. Inside the walls of the city, a hush fell as realization spread. The ring had closed, and Budapest was now a fortress adrift in a sea of war. The Soviets did not rush the final act, but pressed with deliberate weight. They sought to squeeze rather than shatter, to trap their enemy within layers of pressure. Villages around the capital became waypoints in the tightening grip, each one reduced to silence after brief resistance. The roads that once carried goods and travelers now carried only the echo of boots and wheels of war. At night, people in Budapest looked toward the hills and saw faint flashes, like distant storms. The air was cold, the days short, and the rhythm of winter merged with the rhythm of conflict. Rumors spread faster than facts, each retelling sharpening the sense of entrapment. Civilians clung to their homes, while soldiers clung to the idea of orders that demanded endurance. Yet endurance meant facing a slow, tightening pressure from every direction. The city began to live within a circle whose edges drew closer with every day. Inside Budapest, the transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Streets grew quieter, though not from peace, but from the stillness of waiting. Markets still functioned, though with fewer goods, fewer smiles, and more searching glances. Soldiers moved with heavier steps, their uniforms showing the strain of too many days without pause. Churches filled with prayer, whispered more urgently now, yet still held in tones of reverence. The Danube flowed on, indifferent and timeless, though its bridges were watched with wary eyes. Civilians asked one another about the front, about food, about what was to come, but no one could answer with certainty. Radios carried both music and news, yet both seemed distant, as if separated by fog. Children sensed the change most keenly, their play subdued, their laughter caught in their throats. The air of the city was thick with waiting, as though the walls themselves held their breath. Beyond the city's edge, the Soviets drew their lines tighter. They encircled with artillery on the hills and strongholds in the valleys, their numbers growing each day. The Germans inside hoped for relief, imagining armored columns breaking through the ring, but each attempt faltered, met by resistance too firm, too numerous, too steady. The idea of rescue became a distant echo rather than a promise. Within Budapest, whispers of hope grew thinner, carried more by wish than by belief. The fortress city was now isolated, its bridges and buildings its only defense. The people, once linked to a wider nation, found themselves contained within boundaries of fire and steel. From that point onward, the struggle would be measured in endurance rather than movement. The circle had closed, and with it came the stillness of inevitability. Winter deepened as the siege took form. Snow fell lightly, softening the outlines of barricades and frozen fields. The cold wrapped around soldiers and civilians alike, uniting them in hardship, even as it separated them in purpose. Fires burned in hearths where fuel remained, while elsewhere families huddled together for warmth. The river froze in places, carrying the brittle silence of ice. In such weather, sounds carried far distant artillery rumbles, felt like low thunder stretching across the sky. The Soviets settled in their lines, while the defenders settled into expectation. Each day grew shorter, each night longer, the rhythm of waiting more defined. In the narrowing world of Budapest, time itself seemed to contract with the ring. The season of winter became the season of siege, each breath marked by the tightening circle. For many within the city, the encirclement brought both fear and strange clarity. The future no longer stretched into distant possibilities. It was bound within the ring around them. Life reduced itself to essentials: food, warmth, and the quiet endurance of passing days. Soldiers stood watch with sharper eyes, while civilians counted their supplies with care. The luxury of choice diminished, replaced by the certainty of constraint. Even music, when played, carried a deeper weight, reminding listeners of what once had been. The city did not yet suffer the full violence of siege, but it carried its shadow. That shadow reached into every household, every conversation, every dream. And though the night still brought silence, it was silence tinged with waiting. The circle was no longer distant. It was now a presence that touched every life within. Thus the encirclement was not a sudden shock, but a slow, inevitable closure. The Soviets had drawn their net, and inside it, Budapest had been caught. The German and Hungarian defenders prepared for a fight without escape, while civilians braced for hardship without end. The streets of the city still echoed with footsteps, but those echoes now sounded different, thinner, more deliberate. Light fell upon buildings that seemed unchanged, yet every window, every door, every bridge carried new meaning. The capital of Hungary had become a citadel cut from the world, a fortress bound within a tightening circle. Hope was still spoken, but with a voice grown quieter, almost whispered. The siege had not yet broken fully upon the city, but its outlines were drawn, unmistakable and firm. Budapest was now living within a closed horizon, bounded by fire on all sides. The world narrowed to a circle of fire, and inside it the city began to hold its breath. December descended upon Budapest with quiet insistence, covering the city in soft layers of snow that seemed to mute both sound and thought. The streets were pale and luminous, the river reflecting a pale silver under overcast skies. Footsteps crunched gently over frozen pavements, as civilians and soldiers alike moved with careful purpose. Smoke rose from chimneys in irregular spirals, carrying the faint scent of wood and coal through the chilled air. Soldiers huddled in corners, their breath visible, warming the space around them for brief moments. Families gathered indoors, wrapping themselves in blankets, counting what little provisions remained. The bridges glimmered with frost, their arches casting delicate shadows on the rippling water below. Even as the city appeared serene, the knowledge of encirclement settled like a cold weight upon the hearts of those within. Each snowflake seemed to mirror the fragility of the day. And through the quiet, the city waited, as though holding its breath under winter's hush. Food grew scarce as the siege continued, and small meals became treasured rituals of warmth and survival. The scent of stale bread lingered in homes, sometimes shared with neighbors who had no other refuge. Soldiers carried the burden of both defense and hunger, their hands roughened by the cold and the unyielding work of fortifications. Children learned early how to stretch each morsel, how to share in silence without complaint. Markets had become quieter, their stalls offering glimpses of emptiness instead of abundance. The wind carried a sharpness that spoke of distance and isolation, threading through alleys and courtyards alike. Windows became lanterns, their faint light a signal of persistence against shadow. Flowing silently beneath bridges, seemed to slow with the weight of ice forming at its edges. Time moved differently here, measured in the stretching hours between meals and warmth. The cold was a presence, steady and unrelenting, pressing softly upon all who remained. Inside homes and bunkers alike, warmth was both physical and emotional, a fragile tether to comfort. Families huddled together in rooms that had been cleared of unnecessary furniture, creating small islands of heat. Fires were coaxed into life with care, their flames flickering against walls and ceilings, offering both light and reassurance. Outside, the snow shimmered like frost over forgotten gardens and abandoned courtyards. Soldiers and civilians exchanged quiet words, gestures of solidarity passing between them without ceremony. The sounds of the city, the creak of shutters, the sigh of wind through chimneys, became companions in the long hours. Silence was not emptiness, but a gentle companion, wrapping each listener in introspection. Letters, smuggled or delivered by cautious hands, carried news from distant friends and family, small currents of life, threading through isolation. Even in restraint, there was a sense of quiet humanity, subtle and persistent. The cold made every act of care more vivid, more necessary, and more poignant. The snow transformed familiar streets into a landscape of soft shapes and muted color. Cobblestones disappeared beneath white blankets, and the outlines of trees and rooftops blurred into gentle contours. People moved more slowly, each step deliberate, as if honoring the stillness around them. The Danube, now edged with ice, reflected the silver-grey sky in long, unbroken stretches. Soldiers patrolled with measured tread, their silhouettes tracing the quiet rhythm of watchfulness. The city seemed to pause, its usual noises softened or swallowed entirely. Even small details, a cat slipping through an alley, the creak of a door, the faint smell of burning coal, were heightened in significance. Conversation dwindled to whispers, not from fear alone, but from respect for the fragile hush. Light bent differently across snow-laden surfaces, revealing shadows where warmth and movement lingered. And in this softened cityscape, Budapest carried both its beauty and its quiet tension. Winter's grip affected more than just the body. It touched thought and memory as well. Stories of the past circulated with greater frequency, memories shared around fires or across tables. Children were told of snowfalls long ago, of Christmases when the streets rang with laughter and light. Adults remembered markets full of produce, bridges bustling with life, evenings filled with music from distant cafes. These recollections became brief reprieves, gentle moments of warmth amid uncertainty. Even as hunger whispered in the background, the mind could drift to times less burdened. Snow outside softened the edge of reality, offering a temporary embrace of quiet reflection. The city itself seemed to pause in response, letting history fold over present life, and within every household, small gestures of care became acts of defiance against despair. Time slowed under the snow, turning memories into companions for those who waited. At night, Budapest glimmered under the muted reflection of street lamps on snow, a city of shadows and soft light. Windows glowed warmly, a patchwork of domestic warmth stitched across a frozen canvas. Soldiers moved silently along barricades, their presence both reassurance and reminder of the world, pressing in from beyond. Families listened to distant sounds, the faint rumble of artillery, the far-off shuffle of troops, the whisper of wind through empty streets. Silence dominated, yet it was alive with subtle shifts, each breath and footstep magnified. The Danube's waters mirrored the muted sky, carrying the stillness downstream. In such nights, the city's rhythm slowed to a gentle heartbeat, measured in patience and endurance. Even the smallest tasks, bringing water, tending fire, wrapping a child's hands, felt sacred. The quiet of the snow and the hush of expectation merged into a singular, hypnotic moment. And as darkness deepened, Budapest held its breath beneath winter's soft cloak. Civilians and soldiers shared the city in a quiet alliance, both bound by the challenges of cold and hunger. The fortress declaration made the distinction between roles less clear. Every hand, every body had purpose. Children learned to move carefully through barricaded streets, playing only in safe pockets of light and shadow. Adults found subtle routines that preserved warmth, patience, and dignity. Supplies were distributed cautiously, each portion measured with care and thought. Even small comforts, a cup of warm tea, a shared blanket, a whispered story were celebrated. The snow outside pressed silently against the city's walls, a gentle reminder of both beauty and constraint. Windows framed the world as a still, silvered panorama, frozen yet alive. Each day passed slowly, weighted with endurance, yet punctuated by quiet acts of connection. Through these shared rhythms, the city continued, bound by winter's grip and human care. And so December pressed upon Budapest, soft and unyielding, wrapping the city in both splendor and hardship. Streets were luminous under snow, the Danube carried silvered reflections, and the hills of Buda stood serene in cold light. Yet, beneath this quiet beauty, hunger, cold, and encirclement were ever-present companions. Soldiers kept watch along the frozen streets, while families gathered around fires, tracing warmth across tired hands. Time itself seemed to stretch, measured by patience, careful planning, and whispered routines. The city's life continued, fragile but persistent, under winter's soft embrace. Even as the world beyond the walls closed in, Budapest held its quiet dignity. Each breath, each small act, became a testament to endurance. Life persisted in its smallest details, wrapped in frost and shadow. As the snow fell gently, silence was broken only by the distant rumble of guns. By late December, the quiet tension that had settled over Budapest gave way to motion along the outer streets. The Red Army began pressing forward, testing the strength of the fortress with measured force. Soldiers moved in columns, their presence felt as a low vibration through frozen ground and quiet avenues. Barricades that had seemed permanent were challenged, shifted, and sometimes overcome. Windows glimmered with brief reflections of activity, while doors once closed against the cold opened to unknown faces. Inside, civilians heard the distant echo of movement and recognized the rhythm as different from the ordinary. The Danube, flowing silently between the city's halves, seemed to mirror the change, carrying only the quiet sigh of water. Even in the soft light of winter mornings, the air was thick with anticipation. Footsteps became heavier, the city's heartbeat quickening imperceptibly. And so the first waves of the assault reached the outer edges, where history and present converged in tension. Buildings along key avenues became both shelter and obstacle, changing hands as the tide of battle flowed. Soldiers moved cautiously, pausing to assess the quiet streets before advancing. Each building held stories, echoes of families, of shops, of lives suddenly layered with urgency. Windows, once portals to light and sky, were now openings to observation and strategy. The wind carried both the cold and the subtle scent of wood smoke, mingled with earth and stone disturbed by movement. Civilians pressed into basements, cellars, and hidden corners, watching shadows and listening with careful attention. The pace of life had slowed in response to the uncertainty, measured in cautious steps and whispered guidance. Even the bridges felt different, their spans now connecting, not neighborhoods but contested lines. Time seemed suspended, stretched across the silent intervals between movements. The city itself became a participant, every stone and street echoing with the presence of armies. From the hills of Buda, the river and the wide boulevards of Pest, the city's contours were alive with careful calculation. Artillery and infantry pressed from multiple directions, each movement deliberate, each pause purposeful. Soldiers, though unseen, left impressions on the streets, in the form of footprints, sled tracks, and temporary shelters. Shops and homes offered brief refuge, then vanished into strategic use, their meanings shifting with every hour. The Danube reflected the grey sky, its flow unchanged, yet resonant with unseen forces. Footfalls carried significance, each echo across stone a signal of motion and presence. Silence alternated with brief bursts of activity, creating a rhythm that was both hypnotic and tense. Even in the calmest moments, the city seemed to anticipate the next shift in its story. The patterns of movement traced invisible lines, connecting distant points across the frozen streets. In these hours, Budapest became a living map of endurance and calculation. Civilians moved quietly within the spaces left for them, sharing warmth and measured supplies. Families huddled together in corners, listening to the distant rhythm of steps and the soft, unfamiliar sound of engines. Children drew close to parents, sensing change even without fully understanding it. Windows provided glimpses of approaching figures, only to be closed again in the hush of uncertainty. Fires burned where they could be safely managed, light flickering across walls and floors. The Danube mirrored the winter sky, flowing steadily past, indifferent to human struggle above. Even in moments of fear, there were small acts of care, sharing a blanket, offering a morsel of bread, a whispered word of reassurance. The city held itself, steady yet tense, a quiet actor in a story that was now unfolding. Movement outside was careful, but within, life persisted in its softest rhythms. The rhythm of survival became the pulse of the city under assault. Along the fortified streets, soldiers adapted to the flow of the battle, learning which turns and alleys offered advantage or shelter. Footprints in snow tracked repeated journeys, leaving transient maps of strategy. Each building, once neutral, became a landmark, a waypoint in a subtle choreography of presence. The Danube's bridges, elegant and enduring, were now conduits of movement and careful calculation. Smoke rose gently from chimneys, mingling with the colder air, carrying both warmth and the scent of activity. Civilians became observers, their eyes tracing every shadow, every quiet signal, understanding the city in a new way. Even the winter light seemed altered, softer yet charged with meaning. Streets that had hosted markets, laughter and conversation, now hummed with subtle tension, alive in a different way. The pace of the city was neither fast nor slow, but deliberate, measured by the slow push of armies and the patience of those within. In this stillness and movement combined, Budapest began to know its own resilience. The Red Army's presence was steady, methodical, and unyielding, pressing slowly through the outer defences. German soldiers responded with careful positioning, holding lines, shifting and retreating only when necessary. Each street became a quiet negotiation, every corner a meeting of determination and endurance. Windows and doorways became thresholds of both risk and observation. The snow softened movement, carrying sound in unusual ways, allowing subtle signals to travel farther than expected. The city seemed to breathe in this rhythm, absorbing the steps, the cautious shouts, the silent maneuvers. Even as the conflict pressed on, moments of calm punctuated the tension. Small silences that allowed reflection and careful thought, footsteps across frozen ground, the occasional clatter of supplies, the gentle hum of distant voices, created a layered soundscape. Every day marked a subtle shift, a trace of presence left by those moving through the city. And with each shift, the fortress city deepened into its own story of endurance. Within homes and shelters, civilians and soldiers shared an unspoken understanding of proximity. Each movement outside carried meaning. Each shadow across the street was noted and interpreted. The Danube flowed beneath bridges, its gentle motion contrasting the careful navigation above. Fires flickered behind windows, creating pockets of warmth in rooms where families lingered. Children, often quiet, learned the rhythm of survival in soft observation and careful gestures. Adults distributed supplies with precision, their awareness heightened by the presence of soldiers and the encroaching tide. The snow outside reflected a winter sky, serene yet loaded with consequence. Even the smallest details, a faint echo, a displaced object, a whispered signal, formed part of the city's unfolding awareness. The cadence of movement became a shared language, subtle and patient. The city, encircled and alive, measured life in quiet rhythms and cautious steps. By nightfall, the first assault had left its imprint on the city. Subtle yet undeniable. Streets had shifted in meaning, buildings had changed hands, and the rhythm of life had adapted to a new reality. Windows glowed faintly where fires were maintained, Bridges reflected the soft light of lamps, and the Danube flowed silently, carrying only water and reflection. Soldiers rested briefly, civilians remained vigilant, and the city itself seemed to exhale in quiet acknowledgement. Each movement, each step, each pause carried weight, part of the story etched into stone and snow. The winter light softened the edges of reality, yet the tension persisted, a calm presence in the midst of change. Even the air seemed to hum with possibility, cautious but deliberate, and through it all, Budapest learned the meaning of endurance, each heartbeat aligned with the slow rhythm of survival. Streets lit by fire became both battlefield and grave. Budapest had become a city caught in stillness and motion at once, suspended between the forces pressing in from east and west. Soviet artillery lined the hills beyond the Danube. Their presence felt more in vibrations through the earth than in sight. German defences, though firm, traced the city in irregular lines, forming a careful shield that held a fragile balance. Civilians moved cautiously within these spaces, learning the rhythm of survival from day to day. Basements and cellars became havens, their cool, dim interiors sheltering families from the uncertainty above. Fires flickered softly in the corners, casting shadows that stretched and contracted with the breath of those inside. Children listened to whispered conversations, their imaginations carrying them through rooms of quiet tension. The wind traced along the streets outside, bringing with it the muted echoes of distant movement. Life had become a delicate negotiation between necessity and fear. In the shadow of two armies, the city learned to hold its breath. Families gathered in corners, blankets wrapped tightly, as the rhythm of distant guns punctuated long hours. Meals were shared in silence, measured to last as long as possible. Windows, once portals to sunlight and life, framed only shadows and movement beyond reach. The Danube flowed steadily, indifferent to the boundaries of armies and the plight of those watching from above. Soldiers moved along barricades, their footsteps leaving patterns in the snow that were read and remembered by those who lived nearby. Even small gestures, a cup of warm tea, the soft touch of a hand on a shoulder, took on heightened meaning in the quiet tension. The city seemed to contract, each block and alley carrying weight far beyond its physical presence. Conversations were whispered, not from fear alone, but from respect for the fragile hush enveloping all. The rhythm of survival had become an unspoken code, practiced daily with gentle care. In these quiet measures, life and waiting became indistinguishable. The upper floors of buildings carried another layer of presence, where soldiers and lookouts observed and calculated. Windows reflected pale winter light, each one a prism of stillness and expectancy. Streets below remained pathways of careful movement, each step a negotiation with space and risk. Snow softened the edges of the city, muffling sound, yet highlighting the faintest vibration of distant activity. Even the smallest objects, fallen shutters, empty carts, traces of footsteps, told a story to those who watched closely. Children learned the cadence of alertness without fully understanding its meaning. Adults traced the outlines of streets and alleys in their minds, imagining every approach, every hidden passage. Fires flickered behind closed doors, their glow both reassurance and reminder of what was at stake. Outside, the Danube mirrored the grey sky, its flow steady and unhurried. Above and below, Budapest was alive with careful observation and quiet endurance. In cellars and hidden rooms, whispered prayers offered solace where daylight did not reach. Families clung together, voices low, each syllable measured for calm and continuity. Food was scarce, yet shared with care, each portion an act of thoughtfulness and resilience. The cold seeped through floors and walls, yet warmth persisted in proximity, in the soft brush of hands, in small gestures of care. Children pressed close to parents, absorbing the rhythm of breathing, the cadence of patience. Outside, the snow glimmered softly under the winter sky, carrying reflections of a city divided by movement and stillness. Soldiers maintained watch, aware of the delicate balance that allowed life to continue. Even in the hush, the city seemed to carry memory forward, holding the past, present, and anticipation together. Time was a slow river, measured in footsteps, whispers, and the faint creak of walls settling under frost. In these quiet shadows, Budapest held its breath between moments of change. Along the Danube's edge, bridges and quays became silent witnesses to the dual presence pressing upon the city. Ships lay still, frozen by winter and circumstance, their outlines soft against grey water. Footsteps across stone echoed faintly, reminders of the world's careful rhythm. Soldiers moved along streets with deliberate caution, aware that each approach carried consequence. Civilians learned to read these movements, adjusting routines and sheltering in places once taken for granted. The wind shifted, carrying distant murmurs and the scent of smoke, blending the natural and human rhythms into a single current. Snow softened edges, transforming streets into gentle expanses of light and shadow. Every small sound carried meaning. Every pause held the weight of potential. Even the Danube, flowing steadily past, seemed to slow in reflection of the city's quiet tension. In the spaces between river and stone, Budapest lived cautiously, balancing presence and endurance. The winter light refracted softly across rooftops, illuminating patterns of frost that traced streets and alleys. Soldiers maintained positions with quiet diligence, aware of both the terrain and the civilians nearby. Families in cellars whispered, sometimes stories, sometimes plans, sometimes nothing at all. Children learned patience, pressing close to warmth, and listening to the soft, steady rhythm of survival. The snow outside acted as both cushion and mirror, softening motion while reflecting distant echoes. Windows framed muted landscapes, their frames containing both hope and caution. Footsteps on frozen ground created rhythms that blended with distant murmurs, forming a gentle cadence of life amidst tension. Fires flickered behind closed shutters, their light dancing across pale walls. Even silence was textured, carrying meaning in every space, every breath, every pause. And through this quiet, the city endured, suspended between vigilance and reflection. In the upper stories and narrow streets, the presence of armies shaped the cadence of daily life. Movement was deliberate, measured, each step carrying intention. Families stayed near warmth, their voices low, their attention drawn to distant signals. The Danube reflected the winter sky, steady and indifferent, a quiet companion to those inside. Snow lay thick upon the streets, softening sound and creating subtle boundaries of movement. Fires glimmered gently, providing guidance and comfort without illumination of danger. Children slept near parents, absorbing the slow rhythm of endurance. Adults exchanged quiet words, gestures of reassurance, and careful distribution of resources. Even small actions, a cup of water, a wrapped blanket, a whispered name, became acts of resilience. In the shadows of the basements, the war spoke in whispers and in silence. By evening, Budapest had settled into the rhythm imposed by its encirclement. The city, though alive, moved softly, aware of the presence pressing inward and outward. Families huddled, soldiers maintained watch, and streets carried only muted echoes of activity. Fires behind shutters glimmered like quiet signals of persistence. Bridges reflected the soft light of winter, and the Danube flowed steadily beneath. The walls, buildings, and alleys themselves seemed to understand the delicate balance of life and pressure. Even in darkness, the city held memory, reflection, and cautious hope. Footsteps, muffled by snow, traced familiar paths with renewed awareness. The rhythm of survival continued, subtle yet persistent, weaving connection between the living and the spaces they inhabited. Budapest endured quietly, suspended between vigilance and the soft hush of anticipation. In the shadows of the basements, the war spoke in whispers and in silence. Budapest's bridges had long been arteries of life, connecting Buda and Pest across the flowing Danube. They carried footsteps, carriages, and stories, linking families, markets, and neighborhoods. Winter light reflected upon their stone and iron, making them gleam like quiet monuments in the soft haze of December. Yet, as the siege pressed on, these lifelines became both passage and peril. The Germans, fearing the city's fall, prepared subtle demolitions, their work measured and precise. Soviet artillery kept careful watch from afar, each echoing shot a reminder of the pressures shaping the city. Civilians watched from rooftops and windows, sensing the changes without fully seeing them. The Danube flowed steadily beneath, indifferent to the structures above it. Light bent softly across the bridges, highlighting arches and cables that had carried so much life. And in the hush of winter, the city felt the first tremors of separation. The bridges became strategic points, each a delicate balance between connection and danger. Soldiers moved cautiously along the edges, aware of both collapse and bombardment. The flow of traffic slowed, then stopped, as preparations took form in quiet urgency. Snow coated the spans, softening the outlines yet masking the tension that lingered. The Danube's reflections shimmered beneath, carrying the movement above as gentle ripples across its frozen edges. Civilians on either side observed with muted fascination and careful apprehension. The air held a faint scent of iron and coal, mingling with winter's chill. Each step along the bridge became purposeful, measured against risk and necessity. Even the light of day seemed aware of the looming fracture, softening where shadows lingered. The city's lifelines were no longer certain, and the distance between sides began to widen. Demolition crews worked quietly, their gestures small yet decisive, shaping the future of streets and neighborhoods. Soldiers oversaw the placements, timing each measure with cautious calculation. Civilians observed from below, their movements slower, measured against the rhythm of what might come. The Danube continued its steady flow, unhurried, carrying reflections of stone and sky. Smoke from distant fires mingled with the winter air, softening outlines and creating layers of grey and silver. Children pressed close to parents, watching windows and rooftops, learning the language of waiting. Even the snow took on new significance, marking footsteps, impressions, and the passage of those moving carefully along bridges and streets. The city seemed to hold its breath, aware that its lifelines could fracture with subtle precision. And through all of this, the quiet rhythm of survival persisted, steady and patient. Soon those rhythms would shift, carried by the slow arc of falling structures. One by one, the bridges began to fail under pressure. Each fracture measured, each collapse deliberate. Stone and iron gave way, sending echoes across water and streets alike. The Danube reflected each change, its surface catching the light and shadow of transformation. Civilians retreated to safer quarters, observing the fractures from cellars and hidden corners. Soldiers adjusted their positions, mindful of both the remaining structures and the wider pattern of the siege. Winter light softened the edges of broken arches, turning destruction into a quiet, melancholy geometry. Footsteps across the city slowed as routes shifted, pathways once certain now uncertain. Even the smallest crossing carried weight, each decision a measure of both risk and necessity. The wind traced along the riverbanks, carrying sound and scent in equal, indifferent measure. And as each bridge fell, the city felt itself split, east from west, memory from momentum. The fracture of bridges changed not only movement but perception, reshaping the city in subtle ways. Streets became isolated corridors, neighborhoods separated by water and absence. Soldiers adapted to new lines of defense, moving with care along edges once open. Civilians learned the contours of isolation, finding small refuges in familiar streets now rendered distant. The Danube reflected winter skies, its flowing calm contrasting the quiet anxiety above. Windows offered glimpses of distant activity, light glimmering like soft signals. Fires in homes became beacons of endurance, guiding the isolated and providing warmth to those within. Even the snow seemed different, holding impressions of absence where life had once passed freely. Each fragment of bridge carried stories of connection, now interrupted, echoing in memory and reflection. The city's lifelines were broken, and yet its heartbeat persisted, careful and deliberate. From cellars and upper floors, people listened to the changes, noting every echo and vibration. The rhythm of the river carried whispers of falling stone, each tremor a subtle message. Soldiers adjusted their vigilance, aware that movement and access had transformed overnight. Families moved quietly through streets that felt larger and more distant than before. The wind traced along empty spans, softening the harshness of fracture. Snow reflected the grey light of a winter sky, shimmering over structures now gone. Footsteps became thoughtful gestures, each measured for care and reflection. Even the smallest gestures, a hand extended, a blanket shared, a whisper of encouragement, carried significance. The city, divided by water, adapted slowly, learning new patterns of connection and endurance. And in the soft, fractured light, Budapest began to know separation as part of its rhythm. Bridges that had carried generations now existed only in memory, their shadows lingering across frozen streets. Soldiers, civilians, and children traced routes in their minds, aware of gaps and new lines of passage. The Danube continued to flow, carrying reflection and subtle movement beneath a quiet sky. Fires burned in pockets across both banks, soft glimmers of life amidst disruption. The snow accentuated distance, creating gentle expanses where once there had been connection. Even the wind seemed to carry stories of loss and adaptation, weaving between buildings and down alleys. Windows framed light and shadow, marking spaces where continuity persisted, despite fracture. The rhythm of the city continued, slower but deliberate, shaped by necessity and endurance. Every step, every glance, every careful gesture became part of a quiet choreography of survival. One by one, the bridges fell, and the city split in two, east and west, survival and despair. As the last spans disappeared, or lay fractured across the Danube, Budapest adjusted to its divided state. Streets and neighborhoods learned new paths. Families found alternate routes, and soldiers moved with careful attention to shifting terrain. The winter sky reflected softly in the river, carrying the echoes of absence and endurance alike. Light fell gently across broken stone and ice, highlighting both loss and persistence. Fires glimmered behind windows on each bank, small signs of life connecting separated halves through warmth and memory. Even in the hush of evening, the city's heartbeat could be felt in careful footsteps, whispered guidance, and patient observation. Snow softened movement and muffled sound, allowing reflection to deepen alongside adjustment. The bridges had fallen, yet the people remained, resilient in their quiet adaptation. Each moment became a meditation on continuity within fracture. And so the city held itself, divided yet enduring, along the silent, frozen Danube. As winter pressed on, the hope of relief stirred quietly across the edges of the city. German and Hungarian forces beyond the encirclement planned tentative movements, their preparations measured and precise. Inside the city, defenders considered paths through snow-covered streets, seeking avenues that might carry them to freedom. Footsteps left impressions in the soft white layers, fleeting maps of tentative escape. Windows reflected muted light, shadows stretching across walls and floors, tracing the rhythm of anticipation. Fires flickered behind shuttered panes, warming small rooms where families and soldiers alike waited and wondered. The Danube flowed steadily beneath frozen edges, its waters indifferent to the strategies above. Even the wind carried hints of motion, soft currents across quiet streets and frozen courtyards. Civilians listened to distant sounds, interpreting each echo with care and restraint. The city held its breath as plans for movement unfolded in silence and shadow. The first attempts were deliberate and cautious, measured against snow-laden streets and hidden corners. Soldiers moved along familiar routes, each step a negotiation with distance and risk. Light from winter afternoons filtered through clouds, reflecting softly on pavements and icy surfaces. Civilians watched from cellars, counting time by the subtle vibrations through walls. Every movement above ground carried meaning, signaling both intent and hope. The Danube's surface shimmered quietly, mirroring the muted tension of the city. Fires behind closed doors glimmered like silent beacons, highlighting human endurance. Even the smallest gestures, a shared blanket, a whispered instruction, became acts of coordination. Snow muffled sound, creating an atmosphere of calm that contrasted with the underlying urgency. But for every path taken, the way forward seemed to vanish in shadow and smoke. Relief forces beyond the encirclement approached cautiously, their presence felt more in movement than in sight. Soldiers pressed forward across frozen fields and quiet avenues, aware of both distance and danger. The wind carried hints of activity, subtle signals that the city's defenders sensed without needing words. Civilians pressed closer to warmth, their attention tracing every shadow and sound. Footsteps over snow became a rhythm of hope and hesitation, carrying the pulse of possibility through the still streets. Windows framed muted light, casting soft rectangles on floors and walls below. Fires burned gently, sustaining warmth and quiet focus. The Danube reflected grey skies, holding steady beneath the tension above. Even the smallest shifts, a displaced shutter, a soft murmur, a faint signal, were imbued with significance. Yet each advance seemed to dissolve, leaving only the hush of uncertainty behind. Inside the city, breakout attempts followed careful plans, streets becoming cautious pathways of movement. Soldiers and civilians alike moved quietly through narrow alleys, pausing to listen for distant echoes, snow-softened steps, carrying sound in unpredictable ways. Demanding patience and attention, windows reflected light from lamps and fires, tracing shapes of hope and vigilance. Each building became a waypoint, its doors and halls marking the rhythm of progress or retreat. The Danube's waters flowed silently beneath bridges and broken spans, indifferent yet present. Even in moments of seeming progress, paths often closed or vanished into smoke and distance. Children pressed close to parents, absorbing the slow rhythm of waiting and movement. Adults shared subtle signals and guidance, weaving coordination through hushed whispers. The night sky filled with tracer fire, but the way out always vanished into smoke. Winter light refracted softly across the city as defenders retraced steps, readjusting to closures and obstacles. Every street carried the memory of movement, footsteps pressed into snow, faint lines of endeavor etched in silence. Soldiers adapted, considering alternative routes through quiet neighborhoods. Civilians observed from shadowed corners, noting shifts in light, snow, and sound. Fires behind doors glimmered like cautious promises, marking areas of warmth and presence. The Danube mirrored a sky heavy with clouds, flowing steadily, indifferent to hope or frustration. Even distant murmurs became meaningful, part of a silent rhythm the city learned to read. Windows framed silhouettes, soft and cautious, highlighting the interplay of persistence and patience. Each attempt, though fleeting, carried lessons in endurance and quiet adaptation. Paths opened and closed like gentle tides, teaching the city the measure of patience. Relief forces, unseen yet sensed, pressed forward across frozen approaches with careful diligence. The wind traced soft lines across the open fields, carrying subtle signs of movement. Soldiers paused, recalibrating to changing conditions, listening to the city's quiet responses. Snow reflected dim winter light, creating an even layer of distance between observer and observed. Civilians moved in small, deliberate circles, maintaining warmth and safety, while the pulse of the siege pressed on. Fires flickered behind windows, guiding and comforting, without revealing more than necessary. Even the Danube, flowing beneath fractured bridges, seemed to hold its own measured rhythm. Steps across pavements, rustling of blankets, gentle murmurs, all became part of the quiet orchestra of endurance. Each fleeting advance reminded the city of its fragility, yet also of its persistence. And slowly the rhythm of hope wove through the stillness, even as the way remained uncertain. Within cellars and hidden rooms, families spoke softly, tracing possibilities in hushed tones. Children absorbed the cadence of patience, their small hands pressed to warmth and comfort. Every shift outside the walls carried meaning, every distant echo, a subtle measure of progress or retreat. Snow muffled noise, amplifying small signals and gestures of coordination. Soldiers adjusted positions carefully, aware that the city's rhythm had changed with each attempt. Fires glimmered gently in corners, marking spaces of safety and endurance. Windows reflected quiet light, a reminder of life continuing above the frozen streets. Even small movements, a step, a gesture, a whispered instruction, became acts of intentional care. The Danube flowed with steady patience, a silent companion to those navigating fractured paths. In the hush of winter nights, each step forward carried both hope and fragility. As night deepened, the city settled into a rhythm of observation and quiet endurance. Paths once possible had closed, yet memory and vigilance remained. Civilians pressed close to warmth, soldiers maintained watch, and the rhythm of survival continued in gentle, deliberate measures. Snow reflected soft starlight, carrying faint impressions of movement and retreat. The Danube flowed beneath, its calm surface a counterpoint to the tension above. Fires glimmered behind shutters, small signals of continued presence and resilience. Even as hope flickered in fleeting attempts, the city learned to adapt, tracing new lines through familiar spaces. Steps across frozen streets, whispered guidance, and quiet observation formed the pattern of endurance. And through it all, Budapest breathed slowly, carrying both anticipation and acceptance within its frozen, luminous streets. The night sky filled with tracer fire, but the way out always vanished into smoke. Gillette Hill, rose above the city like a silent sentinel, its stone walls bearing witness to centuries of history. Atop it, the Buda citadel held its command with careful diligence, overlooking both the Danube and the frozen streets below. Fires began to ripple across the hill, gentle at first, then more insistent, carrying smoke and light in equal measure. Civilians in the lower quarters watched in quiet awe, aware that the city's landmarks were being reshaped by flames and strategy. Winter air carried a subtle warmth from distant fires, mingling with the crisp scent of snow and stone. Soldiers moved with deliberate care, maintaining positions while observing the subtle shifts in light across the cityscape. Even as structures burned, the rhythm of life persisted, measured in footsteps and the soft murmurs of the inhabitants. Windows reflected flickering hues, softening the stark outlines of stone with gentle shadow. The Danube flowed beneath, steady and indifferent, carrying reflections of orange and grey across its surface. The fortress of history itself burned, yet the city refused to fall. Flames traced the contours of walls and battlements, spreading slowly along ridges and parapets. Smoke drifted over streets and courtyards, softening the sharp edges of towers and arches. Civilians remained in hidden rooms, observing the transformation from a distance, the glow illuminating walls and ceilings in gentle pulses. Soldiers adjusted positions, aware of the shifting landscape and the need for vigilance amidst the firelight. Snow reflected the amber glow, creating pools of warmth on pavements and rooftops. Even the quiet Danube mirrored the flickering light, flowing steadily, as if unconcerned with the changes above. The wind carried a mixture of scents, stone warmed by fire, smoke drifting across neighborhoods, and winter air crisp and cold. Footsteps traced familiar paths, careful and deliberate, each carrying purpose and measured attention. Fires cast shadows that moved like dancers, soft and unpredictable across walls and streets. The city absorbed each flicker, learning to live with light and shadow intertwined. From hilltop and street alike, the glow of fire marked the heart of Budapest with quiet insistence. Soldiers on terraces observed the reach of the flames, measuring both danger and opportunity in careful increments. Civilians whispered, sharing observations and guiding one another through the muted streets below. Children pressed close to parents, absorbing the rhythm of endurance and quiet reflection. Windows framed soft, flickering rectangles of warmth, shadows moving gently within. Snow muffled movement outside, allowing the sounds of subtle change to carry with delicate emphasis. The Danube reflected light from both city and sky, flowing with an unhurried patience that contrasted with urgency above. Fires traced lines across walls and rooftops, reshaping perception while preserving structure in memory. Each flicker was a quiet dialogue between past and present, memory and survival. And yet, in the glow and smoke, the city continued its careful, patient heartbeat. The citadel itself stood resilient, its stone absorbing warmth and shadow with equal grace. Soldiers maintained vigilance, their movements precise, flowing in rhythm with the city's quiet pulse. Civilians found comfort in observation, in small gestures of reassurance, in whispered words exchanged across sheltered spaces. The wind traced along streets and alleys, carrying warmth from fires while softening edges of light and shadow. Footsteps fell softly over snow, leaving transient maps of movement and endurance. Windows reflected the dancing flames, creating a mosaic of color and shadow that softened the harshness of change. Even as smoke rose in spirals, curling toward the winter sky, the rhythm of life persisted, steady and measured. The Danube flowed beneath, unhurried and indifferent, a constant companion to the quiet determination above. Fires illuminated history, yet the city remained present, alive in memory and observation. In the gentle blaze, Budapest learned that endurance can glow even amidst destruction. Along the Danube's edge, reflections of fire shimmered across water, bending light and shadow in soft waves. Bridges, already fractured, carried the warm glow back and forth, connecting memories of what had been with the present. Soldiers maintained positions across the city, careful not to let urgency disturb the quiet rhythm of observation. Civilians moved with care, passing information in whispered tones, sharing warmth and sustenance in measured increments. The snow softened edges, muffling the smallest sound, and highlighting the gentle sway of firelight on walls and streets. Even distant echoes of movement took on meaning, their cadence marking the passage of endurance. Windows held reflections of both sky and flame, reminding those within of the continuity of life and presence. Footsteps traced familiar paths, conscious of every detail, every angle, every shadow. Fires carried warmth and gentle illumination, and yet the city's heartbeat remained steady beneath. The fortress of memory and stone held, even as its heart glowed and whispered. From cellars and upper floors, families observed the unfolding patterns with quiet attention. Children pressed close, absorbing the rhythm of flickering light and soft murmurs. Adults traced the movement of shadows across floors, aligning steps and breaths with gentle care. Soldiers maintained watch on terraces and rooftops, balancing presence with restraint. Snow reflected the amber glow, softening angles and creating gentle lines across streets and alleys. Fires flickered behind closed doors, offering comfort and small guidance through the quiet night. The Danube flowed beneath, steady and calm, reflecting both city and sky in quiet contemplation. Even the wind, moving across ridges and rooftops, seemed to carry soft whispers of history and patience. Each moment, measured and deliberate, became part of the city's slow rhythm of endurance. And in every flicker, every shadow, Budapest held both fire and stillness within itself. Smoke spiraled gently into the winter sky, blending with clouds and soft evening light. Soldiers moved along battlements, careful not to disturb the fragile equilibrium of warmth, shadow and vigilance. Civilians listened quietly, tracing every subtle change, every murmur, every flicker. Windows framed movement in soft rectangles, shadows gliding gently across walls and floors. Footsteps across streets, rooftops and bridges carried meaning in silence. Soft and deliberate, fires traced lines of memory and endurance, their warmth comforting those who observed. The Danube's steady flow mirrored patience, carrying reflection downstream in soft undulations. Even in moments of quiet intensity, the city breathed with gentle rhythm, balancing loss and resilience. Each flicker of flame became a meditation on survival, patience and continuity. The fortress of history itself burned, yet the city refused to fall. By evening, Gellert Hill glowed softly amidst a city that had adapted to rhythm, fire, and endurance. Soldiers maintained positions with quiet attention. Civilians huddled near warmth and observation. Windows reflected dancing shadows, creating soft mosaics of light across the frozen streets. The Danube flowed steadily, indifferent to fire yet reflective of its glow. Footsteps traced careful paths through snow, each movement deliberate and gentle. Fires offered warmth, soft illumination, and the sense of continuity in a city of memory. Even the smoke carried a measured presence, spiraling with quiet patience toward the winter sky. The citadel, standing amid flame and shadow, became a symbol of endurance and quiet reflection. And through it all, Budapest held its pulse, patient, deliberate, and softly luminous. The fortress of history itself burned, yet the city refused to fall. Winter deepened across Budapest, blanketing streets and rooftops in still white silence. Inside homes and cellars, cupboards stood empty, the faint scent of past meals lingering in the cold air. Families huddled together, measuring the small reserves of food that remained, mindful of each bite. Soldiers and civilians alike felt the quiet pull of emptiness, a shadow that moved with patient inevitability. The Danube flowed beneath frost-covered banks, indifferent to hunger, yet reflecting the grey light of a winter sky. Even snow carried the weight of scarcity, muffling footsteps and softening movement into careful, deliberate gestures. Windows framed dim light and shadow, showing families in quiet contemplation and effort. The wind traced along alleys and broken streets, carrying faint whispers of endurance and exhaustion. Children pressed close to parents, absorbing the rhythm of scarcity without fully naming it. Hunger moved like a ghost through every street, knocking on every door. With stores empty and markets silent, people turned to unusual measures, searching for sustenance in quiet corners. Leaves, roots, and small animals became fleeting sources of nourishment. Gathered with careful thought, pets vanished from homes, carried off or shared for survival, leaving quiet spaces behind. Fires burned low in hearths, conserving warmth while offering comfort to those who remained near. Even the smallest gesture, a shared cup of water, a whispered instruction, a gently passed morsel, took on heightened significance. Footsteps in the snow became slow, careful, deliberate, conserving energy while tracing familiar paths. Windows reflected soft grey light, the world outside calm, indifferent, yet shadowed with quiet tension. The Danube's flow remained steady, a silent companion to those enduring slow deprivation. Families shared stories, songs, and whispered memories, preserving warmth and human connection in the midst of scarcity. The shadow of hunger pressed softly, shaping movement, thought, and quiet survival. Across empty streets, silence deepened, broken only by the occasional murmur of passing movement. Soldiers maintained vigilance, their routines altered by both necessity and the quiet force of deprivation. Snow softened every sound, muffling echoes, while emphasizing subtle shifts in rhythm. Civilians moved carefully through alleys and courtyards, each step conserving energy and preserving patience. Fires flickered low behind closed doors, their glow comforting yet delicate. Windows reflected dim winter light, the outlines of interiors softened by quiet endurance. Even the Danube, flowing beneath fractured bridges and ice, carried reflections of shadow and faint light. Children pressed close to warmth and whispered guidance, learning the patterns of measured existence. Adults exchanged subtle gestures and small acts of care, maintaining the fragile web of support. In every quiet step, the presence of hunger became a gentle, persistent companion. Footsteps fell lightly on snow-covered streets, each one tracing careful paths between shelter and necessity. Soldiers, civilians, and children alike adapted to scarcity, measuring movement with restraint and awareness. Fires offered warmth without excess, illuminating small areas where families gathered. The wind traced lines along rooftops and alleys, softening sound and carrying quiet scents of smoke and frost. Windows held muted light, casting shadows that danced slowly across floors and walls. The Danube reflected grey skies, its calm surface a counterpoint to the quiet tension above. Even silence carried meaning, marking space and presence in subtle rhythms. Pets no longer filled homes, leaving small absences that echoed faintly in corridors. Each shared morsel, each whispered word, each gentle gesture became part of a quiet survival language. Hunger pressed softly, shaping not just bodies, but the rhythm of life itself. Civilians observed patterns of scarcity with careful attention, noting even the faintest hints of opportunity. Snow-covered streets, alleys, and bridges became both pathways and barriers, dictating movement through the city. Fires flickered behind shutters, small beacons of warmth and continuity. Soldiers maintained routine, careful to conserve energy while preserving safety. The Danube flowed beneath ice and frost, its presence steady and patient, indifferent to human limitation. Windows reflected subtle light, highlighting the contours of quiet activity within. Footsteps were slow and measured, each one a part of the larger cadence of survival. Even the wind, tracing across rooftops and stone, carried the hush of hunger and reflection. Families shared warmth, memories, and whispered guidance, preserving connection in the absence of abundance. The shadow of hunger moved through the city, a quiet, persistent rhythm. Winter light bent softly across frozen streets, emphasizing stillness and subtle patterns. Civilians measured every step, every motion, conserving energy against the quiet pull of scarcity. Fires glimmered in hearths, reflecting both necessity and care, warming the spaces where people huddled. Soldiers maintained positions and routines, aware of limits and the slow demands of survival. Snow muffled sound and softened edges, creating gentle spaces in which movement could unfold deliberately. Windows framed small rectangles of light, showing gentle activity, quiet patience, and shared endurance. Even the Danube, flowing beneath icy edges, reflected the muted sky and faint glimmers of human presence. Pets and companions long gone left spaces of absence that were quietly acknowledged. Children pressed close to warmth and whispered stories, absorbing the rhythm of patience and observation. Hunger moved quietly, shaping both thought and presence without urgency. Across rooftops and alleys, quiet gestures carried meaning, the absence of food amplifying every movement. Civilians shared water, warmth, and soft words of encouragement, preserving connection in hushed tones. Snow traced the path of every footstep, softening sound and creating faint impressions of endurance. Fires flickered behind doors, their warmth gentle yet insistent, marking the continuity of care. Soldiers moved with restraint, attentive to both the rhythm of survival and the subtle messages of observation. Windows reflected dim light, showing interiors softened by careful movement and patient whispers. Even the Danube, flowing steadily beneath fractured bridges, seemed to carry both calm and reflection. Children close to their guardians absorbed the quiet lessons of patience and resilience. Every small act of care became a signal, a map of endurance, a quiet thread connecting lives. Hunger moved like a ghost through every street, knocking on every door. By evening, the city had settled into a rhythm of scarcity, patience, and quiet reflection. Footsteps were measured, fires low, and conversations whispered, creating a fragile, soft cadence. Civilians and soldiers alike adapted, finding ways to preserve warmth, memory, and connection amidst absence. Snow reflected the muted winter light, its soft expanse, carrying impressions of every movement. Windows framed gentle shadows, flickering with the faint warmth of endurance. The Danube flowed beneath ice, steady and unhurried, indifferent yet present. Every shared morsel, every whispered instruction, and every gentle touch carried heightened significance. The wind traced streets and rooftops, softening sound and bringing stillness in equal measure. In every quiet gesture, the city carried patience, reflection, and cautious survival. Hunger moved like a ghost through every street, knocking on every door. Beneath the frozen streets of Budapest, a quiet world unfolded, unseen and largely untouched by snow and wind. Sewers, tunnels, and hidden cellars formed a network where soldiers and civilians moved with careful purpose. Footsteps echoed softly on stone floors, carried through corridors lined with shadow and memory. Fires burned gently in hidden corners, providing warmth and small glimmers of light. Water trickled through channels and cracks, joining the soft rhythm of underground life with its own unhurried cadence. The Danube above flowed steadily, its surface unaware of the labyrinth beneath. Families pressed close to one another, seeking comfort amidst cold stone and muffled sound. Soldiers coordinated quietly, their movements deliberate, guided by patience and attention. Even the faintest gesture, a hand extended, a whispered word, a shifting of blankets, held significance in this subterranean rhythm. The city beneath the city became its last breath of defiance. Tunnels twisted beneath streets that above were quiet, broken by snow and rubble. Soldiers carried what they could, moving in measured silence to preserve both warmth and vigilance. Civilians followed soft guidance, learning the contours of hidden passageways through repeated observation. Fires flickered across low ceilings, casting gentle shadows that danced along stone walls. The wind above, cold and restless, was muffled here, replaced by the steady drip of water and soft movement of air. Even the faintest sound, a whisper, a footfall, the shift of clothing, carried weight and meaning. Children pressed close to guardians, absorbing lessons of patience, caution, and endurance. The Danube's flow echoed faintly through underground channels, a distant companion to subterranean life. Footsteps traced careful lines, leaving impressions in dust and debris that would fade with time. Within the quiet stone corridors, the rhythm of survival took its slow and deliberate form. Shelters beneath streets were filled with subtle light and muted warmth, the echoes of both hope and vigilance. Soldiers moved with awareness, mindful of every turn, every shadow, every possible danger. Civilians adjusted to the rhythm of the tunnels, learning how to navigate in quiet observation. Fires glimmered low, illuminating corners with gentle orange hues that softened edges of stone and brick. Snow above reflected pale winter light into shafts that penetrated faintly through cracks and vents. Even distant voices above were muffled, blending with the quiet drip of water and soft rustle of movement below. Children listened, learning the patterns of care, patience, and cautious endurance. Footsteps traced careful arcs, each marking both presence and intention. The Danube flowed silently overhead, carrying reflection and memory along with its steady current. And so life continued, shaped by the gentle cadence of shadow and stone. Corridors twisted and turned beneath familiar streets, creating a quiet maze that demanded attention and care. Soldiers maintained soft routines, coordinating movements in whispers and small gestures. Civilians followed instructions, measuring each step with thoughtfulness and patience. Fires in sheltered pockets glimmered, offering warmth without revealing more than necessary. Snow above muffled every sound from the surface, leaving the underground world in hushed isolation. Windows above, though distant, reflected light that barely reached into these hidden places. Footsteps carried slowly, echoing softly against walls and floors, mapping patterns in the stone. Children pressed closer to guardians, learning endurance through repetition and observation. Even the Danube's distant murmur seemed gentler here, a slow companion to life below. The tunnels became both refuge and passage, a quiet heartbeat beneath the city. Within hidden chambers, people moved in gentle coordination, balancing survival with endurance. Soldiers prepared quietly, maintaining vigilance and preserving warmth. Civilians organized belongings, sharing space and sustenance in careful, measured ways. Fires flickered softly, illuminating walls and ceilings, with gentle, dancing shadows. Snow above glimmered faintly through cracks, adding a soft contrast to the warm glow below. Footsteps fell with care, leaving impressions in dust and stone that marked both presence and patience. Children watched and listened, absorbing lessons in quiet strength and subtle attention. Even water dripping from ceilings joined the rhythm, a steady, unhurried cadence accompanying movement and thought. The Danube flowed above, carrying light and reflection, yet unaware of this hidden world. Beneath the streets, Budapest continued to breathe in whispers and shadows. The underground network became a small city of its own, filled with soft light, muted warmth, and careful motion. Soldiers moved between points, exchanging whispered instructions and measured gestures. Civilians shared information, tending to small needs while preserving safety. Fires glimmered in pockets, illuminating stone and brick with gentle warmth. Snow above reflected winter light, faintly into hidden shafts, casting delicate streaks across the walls. Footsteps traced arcs through corridors, leaving soft impressions that faded with movement. Even children's whispers contributed to the rhythm of life, quiet yet persistent. The Danube flowed steadily above, carrying reflection and calm across frozen streets. Every gesture, movement, and glance was deliberate, forming a slow, continuous pulse of endurance. The city beneath the city became its last breath of defiance. Long hours passed in quiet attention, marked by careful movement and soft observation. Soldiers adjusted positions, coordinating with those nearby while preserving warmth and energy. Civilians navigated corridors, anticipating turns and observing shadows with careful attention. Fires flickered low, casting gentle, moving light across walls and ceilings. Snow above glimmered faintly, reflecting a pale winter glow into deep shafts. Footsteps echoed softly, blending with drips of water and gentle murmurs. Children absorbed the rhythm, learning patience, caution, and the value of subtle signals. Even the Danube, flowing distant yet constant, provided a quiet backdrop to this hidden city. Every gesture became a careful meditation on survival, observation, and presence. In the hush of stone and shadow, Budapest persisted quietly beneath its streets. By evening, the underground world held its own delicate balance, warm, shadowed, and vigilant. Soldiers maintained quiet routines, civilians shared care, and children observed the subtle patterns of survival. Fires glimmered, softly illuminating corners and corridors with gentle light. Footsteps moved with patience and intention, echoing softly against stone and brick. Snow above reflected pale, muted light into cracks and vents, a faint reminder of the world outside. The Danube flowed steadily, carrying reflection and calm, indifferent to the labyrinth below. Even the smallest gestures, a whispered word, a passing of warmth, a measured step held significance. Families pressed together, learning endurance through silence, shadow, and shared attention. In these tunnels, life continued in quiet defiance, patient, deliberate, and soft. The city beneath the city became its last breath of defiance. Budapest, once a city of bridges, light, and soft murmur along the Danube, now held a quieter, heavier rhythm. Artillery thundered from distant positions, its echoes rolling across streets and courtyards. Buildings, once home to laughter and song, became silent markers of endurance and absence. Civilians moved carefully through narrow streets, seeking shelter and tracing familiar pathways through fractured blocks. Snow and dust mingled, softening edges, carrying faint scent of stone and frozen air. Soldiers observed quietly, noting the city's transformations with solemn attention. Windows reflected muted light through cracks, hinting at life hidden inside. Footsteps on pavements, in alleys, and on broken bridges traced slow arcs of patience and presence. The Danube flowed steadily, carrying reflections of light and shadow alike. Every ruin was a memory erased, every crater a wound that would never fully heal. Districts once vibrant and full of color now lay in quiet fragmentation, the outlines of streets visible but altered. Soldiers and civilians moved in careful patterns, tracing known paths while avoiding fragile structures. Fires flickered in scattered corners, soft glimmers marking presence in a muted city. Snow softened sound, carrying echoes of distant movement and muffled voices. Windows reflected the grey light of winter, revealing faint silhouettes of persistence and quiet endurance. Even the Danube, flowing beneath bridges and broken stone, remained patient, unhurried, and observant. Children pressed close to guardians, their small presence a quiet reminder of continuity. Footsteps traced arcs of survival, each step deliberate, each pause intentional. The wind carried faint traces of warmth, smoke, and cold, softening the hard edges of devastation. In the hush between echoes, the city maintained a fragile pulse of life. Every street told a story of endurance, every building a testament to patience and quiet observation. Soldiers adjusted positions with careful consideration, aware of fragile walls and the weight of snow above. Civilians shared warmth, movement, and whispered guidance, creating networks of subtle support. Fires glimmered behind closed doors, marking points of safety and light. Snow reflected muted hues, softening shadows, and emphasizing gentle contours across rubble. Footsteps echoed, their cadence forming part of the slow rhythm of survival. Windows framed faint light and movement, preserving glimpses of life amidst absence. The Danube mirrored grey skies and flickering firelight, flowing steadily, as if marking the passage of reflection. Children learned patience and observation, tracing adult patterns with quiet attention. Each moment of presence carried weight, memory, and careful endurance. Familiar landmarks stood altered, their outlines softened by snow and shadow, echoing absence more than presence. Soldiers moved with attentiveness, coordinating softly while observing shifts in light and texture. Civilians traced paths across broken streets, conserving energy and observing quiet signals from neighbors. Fires flickered gently, highlighting corners and interiors without urgency. Footsteps were deliberate, tracing arcs that spoke of routine, endurance, and survival. Windows reflected dim light, casting subtle mosaics of shadow across floors and walls. The Danube flowed beneath bridges and icy surfaces, its calm a constant companion. Children pressed close to warmth and guidance, absorbing patterns of quiet attention and restraint. Every small gesture, shared morsel, or whispered word formed part of the city's pulse. In every echo and shadow, Budapest held memory, light, and resilience. Artillery continued its distant rhythm, a steady pulse that reshaped streets and courtyards. Soldiers and civilians alike adapted, moving with careful awareness, tracing routes of safety and necessity. Fires glimmered low, casting gentle illumination across fractured stone and frozen surfaces. Snow softened sound, muffling distant echoes while emphasizing subtle shifts in presence. Windows framed delicate light, reflecting movement, warmth, and quiet observation. Footsteps fell softly, deliberate and measured, mapping endurance across frozen streets. Children followed adults, learning the rhythm of survival through observation and repetition. The Danube carried reflection and muted light beneath icy edges, indifferent yet patient. Even silence became a meaningful part of life, holding attention and care within its stillness. Every ruin carried memory. Every step traced careful persistence through the city. Streets were quieter now, yet filled with subtle motion, the rhythm of life adapting to the persistent presence of destruction. Soldiers observed patterns, shifting their movements with careful deliberation. Civilians followed muted pathways, sharing warmth and guidance with whispered care. Fires flickered gently, illuminating corners of rooms and passageways without haste. Snow reflected soft winter light, creating gentle contrasts and emphasizing shadowed textures. Footsteps echoed lightly, tracing arcs across pavements, bridges and courtyards. Windows held muted light, reflecting interiors where people persisted with patience and care. Children absorbed patterns of quiet endurance, tracing every movement with soft attention. The Danube continued its steady flow, indifferent but quietly framing the rhythm of life above and below. Every ruin was a memory erased, every crater a wound that would never fully heal. Bridges and thoroughfares, fractured yet enduring, carried careful movements across fractured neighborhoods. Soldiers maintained soft routines, coordinating quietly while observing the city's rhythm. Civilians moved cautiously, aware of fragile structures, lingering echoes, and soft light. Fires glimmered behind doors, highlighting the continuity of presence amidst absence. Snow softened all sound, creating a hushed landscape where every movement carried significance. Windows reflected muted light and the faint traces of movement, showing resilience without haste. Footsteps traced arcs of persistence, deliberate and mindful, echoing softly against stone and rubble. The Danube mirrored the grey winter sky and scattered glimmers of fire, steady and patient. Children learned endurance and quiet observation, pressing close to guardians and warmth. In the hush of snow and shadow, the city maintained a slow and careful heartbeat. By evening, Budapest lay quiet yet alert, a city both fortress and graveyard, its pulse measured and deliberate. Soldiers maintained positions, observing faint changes and soft movement through fractured streets. Civilians traced familiar paths, sharing warmth, whispered guidance, and quiet attention. Fires flickered low, illuminating corners and thresholds with gentle glow. Snow reflected muted light, softening edges and emphasizing gentle contrasts. Windows framed silhouettes of endurance, resilience, and subtle communication. Footsteps fell softly, deliberate, carrying meaning in each measured step. The Danube flowed beneath icy surfaces, indifferent yet present, reflecting both light and shadow. Children observed, absorbed, and learned, tracing patterns of quiet patience and careful survival. Every ruin was a memory erased, every crater a wound that would never fully heal. Beneath the broken streets and fractured buildings of Budapest, cellars became spaces of both refuge and quiet tension. Families huddled together, sharing warmth and whispered conversation, while shadows of mistrust began to stretch slowly across these confined spaces. Small caches of food or warmth were often the subject of quiet negotiation, the delicate currency of survival. Neighbors, once friendly and familiar, sometimes became distant, their eyes reflecting uncertainty and fear. Soldiers moving through streets above influenced life below, their presence both protective and intimidating. The soft murmur of voices carried across stone walls, blending with distant wind and the gentle flow of the Danube. Footsteps in narrow corridors were measured, careful, almost meditative in their deliberate pacing. Fires flickered low, casting subtle shadows that danced across worn stone floors. Children listened and learned, absorbing the rhythm of whispered caution. In the final hours, the enemy was not always across the street. It was sometimes next door. Trust, once assumed, dissolved slowly into hesitation and observation. A shared meal could vanish silently. A whispered word could betray intent, and the quiet of cellars became charged with subtle calculation. Shadows moved along walls with the same soft rhythm as footsteps, blurring lines between need and suspicion. Civilians navigated these hidden networks of passage and storage with careful attention, their eyes tracing patterns in dim light. Fires provided warmth but also illuminated glimpses of intention, revealing small gestures, brief glances, and the quiet calculations of survival. Snow above softened sounds from the streets, creating hushed corridors where every motion was observed. Even children, wide-eyed and silent, absorbed the lessons of careful attention and subtle deception. The Danube flowed above, indifferent yet constant, reflecting both muted light and shadow. Footsteps traced arcs of presence and absence, echoing softly across stone and mortar. Beneath the surface, survival carried its own rules, delicate and unspoken. Quiet markets formed in hidden corners, trading warmth, food, and necessity in subdued barter. Soldiers sometimes intervened, their presence a gentle pressure, guiding the ebb and flow of transactions. Without harsh interference, neighbors exchanged whispered guidance, small favors, and fleeting tokens, all measured against fear and need. Shadows shifted as people moved, sometimes deliberate, sometimes tentative, always cautious. Fires glimmered softly, illuminating corners and faces, revealing both exhaustion and faint calculation. Snow reflected pale light into cracks and vents, a quiet reminder of the winter above. Footsteps traced careful lines, forming maps of trust and hesitation across cellars and corridors. Children followed adults, learning subtle observation, patience, and the delicate dance of human interaction. The Danube carried muted reflection through the city above, constant yet distant. Even in quiet spaces, alliances were fragile, and caution became a companion. Whispers became as important as movement, subtle signals carrying meaning beyond words. A shift in posture, a glance, a faint gesture could indicate intention, warning, or need. Civilians and soldiers alike learned the rhythm of patience, of observing before acting, of sharing without excess. Fires flickered low, casting gentle shadows that softened hard stone edges. Snow muffled distant noise, isolating these underground interactions in hushed focus. Footsteps traced arcs of careful attention, echoing softly in long corridors and small rooms. Children absorbed the rhythm, noticing the subtleties adults practiced. Even the Danube, flowing quietly above, reflected the muted light of endurance and observation. Windows, broken or shuttered, offered faint shafts of winter light, illuminating small pockets of human resilience. In these cellars, trust was measured quietly, shadow by shadow. Sometimes food or warmth became fleeting currency, the reason for cautious approach or hidden intent. Soldiers above maintained soft routines, observing without overt interference, their presence shaping patterns below. Civilians learned to navigate both the generosity and the caution of those around them, balancing need with discretion. Fires glimmered gently, highlighting small clusters of survival and connection. Footsteps fell softly, deliberate and measured, echoing through corridors of stone and dust. Snow reflected faint winter light through cracks, adding gentle contrast to interiors shaped by shadow. Children pressed close to adults, learning patience, caution, and the quiet signals of observation. The Danube carried distant murmurs of winter and reflection, indifferent yet constant. Every small action held significance, weaving a rhythm of care, restraint, and subtle negotiation. In the hush of the cellars, the quiet rules of survival prevailed. Small acts of betrayal were rarely loud. They were almost imperceptible, like a shadow sliding across a wall. A glance, a hidden morsel, or a softly closed door could shift the balance of trust. Civilians and soldiers alike moved carefully, tracing known paths, while observing subtle changes in behavior. Fires glimmered, providing warmth, light, and a faint reflection of intention. Footsteps traced deliberate patterns, echoing softly through corridors and across worn stone. Snow above softened every sound, isolating the underground world in hushed focus. Children absorbed the lessons of observation, subtlety, and patience in every whispered interaction. Even the Danube, flowing with steady calm, marked the passage of time above. Windows framed muted light, offering glimpses of both endurance and quiet tension. In these hidden spaces, the line between friend and stranger softened, blurred by necessity. By evening, cellars carried a rhythm of warmth, shadow, and observation. Soldiers maintained quiet routines, guiding and observing, their movements deliberate. Civilians navigated corridors, balancing caution and need, trading softly for sustenance or warmth. Fires flickered low, illuminating faces, gestures, and small details of human interaction. Snow reflected pale light faintly, tracing patterns across stone and dust. Footsteps fell softly, marking arcs of presence, absence, and careful negotiation. Learning the subtle language of trust, hesitation, and endurance. The Danube flowed above, indifferent yet quietly present, carrying reflection and calm. Every gesture, glance, and whispered word became part of the city's delicate underground pulse. In the final hours, the enemy was not always across the street. It was sometimes next door. Night settled over the fractured city, cellars holding warmth, shadow, and quiet tension. Soldiers observed, civilians moved with care, and children absorbed the rhythms of subtle survival. Fires glimmered gently, marking pockets of presence, care, and vigilance. Footsteps traced deliberate lines across stone and dust, echoing softly in corridors and chambers. Snow muffled distant sounds, isolating the delicate patterns below from the chaos above. Windows offered faint shafts of light, reflecting patience, shadow, and endurance. The Danube flowed quietly, a calm companion to life hidden beneath fractured streets. Even the smallest gestures, a glance, a whispered word, a measured step, shaped the rhythm of trust and survival. Families pressed together, navigating both care and caution, forging fragile continuity. In the final hours, the enemy was not always across the street. It was sometimes next door. Night fell softly over Budapest, cloaking streets, bridges, and alleys in quiet darkness. Beneath the frozen sky, tens of thousands moved slowly, their figures blending with shadows, each step tentative yet urgent. Families pressed together, soldiers guided movements, and civilians followed as best they could, tracing paths they had memorized over weeks. The wind carried whispers, muffled and distant, blending with the faint echo of footsteps on stone. Fires in the city flickered faintly, their light painting soft patterns on walls and frozen debris. The Danube reflected the subtle glow of the night, flowing steadily, carrying memories of every step taken above. Footsteps traced arcs through empty streets, measured and deliberate, as if the rhythm itself could preserve life. Even children, huddled in arms or guided by guardians, contributed to the muted pulse of movement. Shadows stretched across bridges and courtyards, weaving together presence and absence. The last gamble ended in silence, as the Danube bore witness. The night air was cold, carrying the soft scent of snow and stone, of lingering fires and distant earth. Soldiers guided groups with gentle firmness, ensuring quiet order amid the pressing crowd. Civilians moved with patient awareness, following the rhythm of footsteps and whispered directions. Bridges became thresholds of hope, their outlines softened by shadow and frost. Snow muffled distant echoes, creating a hushed environment where movement carried its own quiet significance. Footsteps traced arcs across pavements and broken thoroughfares, deliberate and careful. Fires in hidden corners flickered softly, illuminating walls with gentle, shifting light. Children leaned close to guardians, absorbing the unspoken lessons of patience, caution, and endurance. The Danube flowed steadily beneath the ice and bridges, a quiet companion to the night's fragile pulse. Above and below, Budapest held its breath in measured anticipation. Every movement was weighed against the quiet danger of open streets and fractured paths. Soldiers adjusted positions with subtle care, guiding those who faltered or hesitated. Civilians followed, their steps cautious, tracing lines of safety through familiar and unfamiliar terrain alike. Fires flickered, offering warmth and soft illumination without urgency. Snow reflected muted moonlight, scattering gentle patterns across stone and broken surfaces. Footsteps echoed softly, a continuous rhythm that connected the past and present. Children pressed closer to adults, learning the silent language of endurance and observation. Windows, though dark and often shattered, reflected faint light and shadow from the night. The Danube moved beneath bridges and fractured edges, steady and impartial, observing without haste. In the hush of frozen streets, hope and trepidation moved together as one. Bridges became fragile arteries, connecting east and west, carrying groups across cold, quiet waters. Footsteps traced careful paths, weighted by urgency, yet guided by patience. Soldiers and civilians alike moved with subtle coordination, tracing familiar routes while remaining attentive to sound and shadow. Fires flickered low in distant corners, casting gentle illumination that softened edges of stone and frozen debris. Snow reflected pale winter light, creating delicate contrasts against shadowed structures. Children learned the rhythm of movement through observation, their small hands holding onto guardians' clothing. The Danube flowed beneath, its surface calm, reflecting light and shadow alike. Footsteps marked arcs of presence and absence, each step deliberate, each pause intentional. Even silence became a participant in the rhythm, carrying meaning in its soft persistence. The last gamble ended in silence, as the Danube bore witness. Night deepened, softening the edges of buildings and fractured streets, merging stone, shadow, and snow into quiet patterns. Soldiers maintained careful oversight, moving with patience and quiet authority. Civilians traced paths through alleys and broken courtyards, balancing caution with urgency. Fires glimmered faintly, illuminating corners and hidden niches with gentle light. Footsteps echoed softly, each step deliberate, connecting the flow of movement across the city. Children observed and followed, learning patience and endurance from every gesture. Windows reflected faint glimmers of warmth and shadow, hinting at life within fractured walls. The Danube moved steadily beneath icy surfaces, its calm reflection a silent companion. Snow muffled distant noise, isolating the fragile network of movement in quiet focus. Every step traced a delicate line between hope and surrender. The night sky, though dark, revealed faint outlines of buildings and bridges, softened by snow and distance. Soldiers guided hesitant groups, their gestures subtle yet precise, shaping the rhythm of escape. Civilians moved with careful attention, following soft instructions and tracing arcs across familiar streets. Fires flickered gently, illuminating small clusters of life and movement with warm, muted light. Footsteps carried across frozen surfaces, leaving faint echoes in stone and dust. Snow reflected muted winter light, scattering soft patterns across the city's fractured silhouette. Children huddled close, absorbing the rhythm of patient motion and quiet observation. The Danube flowed below, indifferent yet constant, reflecting faint light and the slow pulse of movement above. Every pause, glance, and whispered word contributed to the fragile balance of hope. In the hush of night, Budapest's final breath moved in soft, measured arcs. By midnight, streets were filled with quiet motion, a slow tide of endurance and determination. Soldiers and civilians traced arcs across bridges and alleys, their presence deliberate and attentive. Fires glimmered low, illuminating interiors and corners with soft warmth. Footsteps echoed gently, forming a continuous rhythm that connected every small movement. Snow muffled distant sound, softening the night and isolating the fragile pulse of motion. Children followed closely, learning patience and observation with every step. The Danube flowed beneath bridges and ice, its surface calm, carrying reflection and memory alike. Windows reflected pale light and shadow, hinting at presence without exposure. Even silence became meaningful, a companion to movement, patience, and careful endurance. The last gamble ended in silence, as the Danube bore witness. By the early hours, movement slowed, the last arcs of escape fading into quiet. Soldiers and civilians alike paused, tracing gentle steps across frozen streets and bridges. Fires flickered softly, illuminating small interiors and corners with gentle light. Footsteps echoed faintly, their rhythm now subdued, marking the passage of night and endurance. Snow reflected pale light, softening edges and shadows in the quiet city. Children pressed close to guardians, absorbing the lingering rhythm of careful motion. The Danube flowed beneath bridges and frozen surfaces, calm, indifferent, and patient. Every glance, gesture, and step held meaning, forming a delicate web of presence and survival. Silence settled over the city, carrying the weight of hopes, fears, and persistence. The last gamble ended in silence, as the Danube bore witness. Buda lay quiet, its streets still and shadowed, the echoes of battle fading into soft memory. Rubble filled the spaces where buildings once stood, and faint outlines of courtyards and bridges remained beneath snow and dust. Survivors emerged slowly, brushing snow from coats, scanning familiar streets that had become strange landscapes. Footsteps traced delicate arcs across broken stone, careful and deliberate, marking presence without haste. The wind whispered through empty alleys, carrying muted scent of cold stone and distant smoke. Fires glimmered in scattered corners, small points of warmth amid vast absence. Children held close to guardians, their quiet breathing blending with the hush of the city. The Danube flowed below, steady and indifferent, reflecting pale light and the shadowed contours of ruins. Windows, shattered or shuttered, held faint reflections of what remained. The storm passed, but what remained was not peace, only silence. Rubble crunched softly beneath careful feet, each step deliberate, tracing paths through fractured streets. Soldiers moved with quiet awareness, ensuring safety, observing, and guiding the faint arcs of survivors. Civilians emerged, exchanging gentle words and gestures, acknowledging endurance, loss, and persistence. Snow reflected muted light across broken walls, softening edges, and blending shadow with the pale winter sky. Fires flickered gently, illuminating corners where warmth persisted and memory lingered. Footsteps echoed in long alleys and open courtyards, carrying the rhythm of quiet presence. Children learned patience and observation, tracing patterns of calm and cautious movement. The Danube flowed beneath bridges and ice, unhurried, carrying reflections of light and the memory of distant movement. Even silence seemed active, holding stories, echoes, and the weight of endurance. In the stillness, Budapest breathed slowly, carrying the marks of what had passed. Buildings, hollowed by time and storm, stood in quiet testament to endurance and fragility. Soldiers traced corridors and streets, moving softly, mindful of fragile structures and delicate remnants of life. Civilians explored familiar streets, finding objects, corners, and remnants that spoke of continuity amid absence. Fires glimmered low, marking small centers of warmth, light, and presence. Footsteps moved deliberately across stone and debris, carrying subtle echoes of reflection and care. Snow blanketed rough surfaces, softening texture, muffling noise, and emphasizing shadowed forms. Children pressed close to warmth and guardians, learning rhythms of safety, quiet observation, and patient endurance. The Danube flowed calmly below, indifferent yet constant, reflecting pale light and muted shapes. Windows offered faint glimpses of movement, memories, and gentle light. The storm passed, but what remained was not peace, only silence. Streets, once channels of chaos and movement, now traced slow, deliberate patterns of presence and reflection. Soldiers and civilians shared subtle gestures, guidance, and care, marking quiet resilience. Fires glimmered softly, casting gentle light and shadows across frozen courtyards and broken stone. Footsteps fell carefully, each carrying attention, memory, and reflection. Snow softened the edges of ruins, creating a hushed environment where every action mattered. Children absorbed the rhythm, learning patience, observation, and quiet endurance. The Danube flowed steadily beneath bridges and frozen surfaces, calm and impartial, reflecting distant light and shadows. Windows reflected muted activity, offering glimpses of warmth, perseverance, and careful observation. Even silence seemed intentional, framing the stillness with quiet presence. In the hush of Buda, every echo became part of the city's slow pulse. Light shifted softly across rooftops and broken walls, carrying the pale hues of winter into alleys and courtyards. Soldiers moved with gentle deliberation, checking passageways and guiding the hesitant. Civilians navigated carefully, brushing snow from paths and observing shadows. Fires flickered low, illuminating corners of activity without urgency. Footsteps traced measured paths, echoing softly across fractured stone. Snow reflected faint light, blending shadow with form, softening the harshness of absence. Children clung to warmth and guidance, learning the rhythm of careful endurance. The Danube flowed beneath, steady, indifferent, carrying reflections of movement, light, and shadow. Every gesture and step held meaning, forming a delicate network of quiet life. The storm passed, but what remained was not peace, only silence. Empty streets stretched into distance, softened by snow, dust, and shadow, carrying muted echoes of the past. Soldiers traced known paths with careful steps, observing, guiding, and protecting. Civilians moved slowly, following subtle cues, tracing arcs through alleys and courtyards. Fires glimmered gently, illuminating interiors, corners, and fragile forms of human persistence. Footsteps echoed across stone and rubble, carrying the quiet rhythm of survival. Snow reflected pale light, merging shadow with structure, softening the memory of absence. Children watched, listened, and learned, absorbing the lessons of patience, observation, and gentle endurance. The Danube flowed steadily below, unhurried, reflecting soft light and muted shapes. Windows offered faint reflections of presence and warmth, a quiet acknowledgement of what endured. In the stillness, Budapest carried its history softly, in breath and shadow. By morning, light spread slowly, revealing fractured streets and softened rooftops. Soldiers and civilians traced paths with gentle care, moving deliberately amid ruins and snow. Fires flickered low, offering small warmth, soft illumination, and continuity. Footsteps echoed faintly, forming arcs of presence, care, and cautious observation. Snow softened distant sounds, creating hushed corridors and courtyards for reflection. Children pressed close to guardians, absorbing lessons in patience, safety, and quiet endurance. The Danube flowed beneath bridges, constant and impartial, reflecting faint light and muted shadows. Windows revealed traces of warmth and movement, marking persistence against absence. Silence held meaning, containing memory, reflection, and the careful rhythm of life. The storm passed, but what remained was not peace, only silence. By evening, Buda lay quiet, a city of shadow stone and muted presence. Soldiers and civilians moved slowly, observing and maintaining the soft rhythm of existence. Fires glimmered, casting gentle light across frozen courtyards and fractured walls. Footsteps traced arcs of patience, endurance, and reflection, echoing softly through long alleys. Snow reflected muted light, blending shadow and form in soft patterns. Children absorbed every gesture and rhythm, learning the subtle language of quiet survival. The Danube flowed steadily beneath, indifferent yet constant, carrying reflections and memories alike. Windows held faint light and movement, offering reminders of life, endurance, and cautious hope. Silence stretched across the city, holding presence, memory, and quiet persistence. The storm passed, but what remained was not peace, only silence. Budapest lay silent beneath a pale winter sky, streets strewn with remnants of life and shadow. Bridges, once graceful arcs over the Danube, had vanished, leaving fractured waterlines and quiet reflection. Rubble filled courtyards, alleys, and squares, softening edges with snow and ash. Survivors emerged slowly, brushing snow from coats, scanning familiar streets now transformed into landscapes of absence. Footsteps echoed softly across stone, tracing arcs of careful exploration. Fires flickered faintly in distant corners, casting low, warm light across frozen surfaces. Children pressed close to guardians, moving with deliberate caution, learning the rhythm of observation and care. The Danube flowed below, steady and impartial, reflecting faint light and shadows of fractured buildings. Windows, shattered or dark, offered silent testimony to endurance and absence. Budapest had endured, but at the cost of its soul. Every street carried memory, a whisper of past laughter and soft footsteps, now replaced by quiet observation. Survivors traced gentle arcs through alleys, searching for signs of life amid shadow and rubble. Fires glimmered low, offering warmth, subtle light, and a focal point for those wandering in winter's hush. Footsteps traced deliberate lines over broken stone, echoing softly through quiet courtyards. Snow softened the edges of ruins, blending shadow ash and fractured stone into muted patterns. Children observed, learning patience, caution, and the delicate rhythm of endurance. The Danube flowed steadily, indifferent yet constant, carrying reflections and faint light along fractured banks. Windows reflected small glimmers of warmth, subtle signs that life persisted quietly. Shadows stretched across broken facades, marking the stillness with gentle weight. Budapest had endured, but at the cost of its soul. Neighborhoods once vibrant now lay silent, streets empty except for careful footsteps and soft murmurs. Soldiers and civilians moved with gentle deliberation, tracing known paths, while observing the subtle signals of others. Fires flickered low in scattered corners, illuminating small clusters of presence without urgency. Footsteps echoed across fractured pavements, each step deliberate, measured, and meaningful. Snow reflected faint light, blending with shadow to create a gentle interplay of form and absence. Children pressed close to guardians, absorbing every nuance of cautious motion. The Danube flowed beneath bridges now reduced to frozen fragments, carrying reflections and memory with quiet persistence. Windows held faint reflections of warmth, light, and fragile human presence. Even silence seemed active, a companion to memory, observation, and endurance. Budapest had endured, but at the cost of its soul. Rubble-strewn courtyards became places of reflection, both for survivors and for the quiet city itself. Footsteps traced paths through snow and stone, soft arcs of measured exploration. Fires glimmered faintly, providing warmth and low illumination, without urgency. Shadows shifted gently across walls, blending form with memory, presence with absence. Children observed quietly, learning the rhythm of careful motion, subtle gesture, and patient endurance. The Danube flowed beneath fractured bridges, its waters calm and impartial, reflecting the muted light above. Windows offered traces of warmth and human presence, subtle reminders of persistence. Every small movement held significance, connecting past and present in gentle arcs of observation. Even silence carried meaning, framing absence with quiet reflection. Budapest had endured, but at the cost of its soul. Streets that once hummed with life now carried only careful motion and faint whispers. Survivors explored slowly, scanning familiar landmarks, transformed by rubble, snow, and shadow. Fires glimmered low, illuminating pockets of warmth and persistence, creating quiet nodes of human presence. Footsteps traced deliberate lines, echoing softly across fractured stone and empty courtyards. Snow softened the rough edges of destruction, blending shadow, ash, and stone into gentle patterns. Learning the rhythm of cautious movement and the subtle language of endurance, the Danube flowed steadily beneath icy bridges, indifferent yet constant, reflecting muted light and shadow. Windows reflected faint warmth, gentle presence, and subtle human continuity. Every gesture and step contributed to a delicate web of observation, survival, and quiet care. Budapest had endured, but at the cost of its soul. By mid-afternoon, light spread softly across rooftops, rubble, and empty streets, painting shadow and stone with muted winter hues. Footsteps traced careful paths through fractured avenues, deliberate and attentive. Soldiers and civilians moved slowly, guided by memory, soft instruction, and observation. Fires glimmered gently, illuminating corners, thresholds, and fragile forms of persistence. Snow reflected pale light, scattering gentle highlights across broken surfaces. Children absorbed the rhythm, tracing arcs of caution, endurance, and careful observation. The Danube flowed below, steady and impartial, carrying reflection and memory alike. Windows offered subtle glimpses of warmth and gentle presence, small points of continuity amid silence. Even silence seemed full, holding memory, observation, and quiet endurance. Budapest had endured, but at the cost of its soul. Evening approached with soft shadows and muted light, stretching long across streets and alleys. Survivors traced arcs of movement through fractured neighborhoods, careful and deliberate, honoring the stillness around them. Fires flickered low, illuminating interiors and corners, subtle markers of presence and warmth. Footsteps echoed faintly across stone and rubble, a rhythm of persistence and quiet reflection. Snow softened the edges of broken structures, blending shadow and form into gentle patterns. Children pressed close, learning patience, observation, and the rhythm of endurance. The Danube flowed beneath, calm and unhurried, reflecting muted light and shadowed outlines. Windows held traces of warmth and human activity, soft glimmers of fragile continuity. Silence settled gently, carrying memory, observation, and the slow pulse of life that remained. Budapest had endured, but at the cost of its soul. Night settled over the city, blanketing rooftops, streets, and courtyards in pale, muted shadow. Footsteps traced slow arcs through fractured streets, deliberate and quiet. Fires glimmered low, offering small warmth, subtle light, and continuity. Shadows stretched gently across walls and rubble, merging presence with memory. Children pressed close to guardians, observing every gesture, motion, and rhythm. The Danube flowed below, constant, calm, and indifferent, reflecting soft light and shadowed forms. Windows offered faint glimpses of warmth and human presence, subtle reminders of fragile endurance. Every step, gesture, and pause held meaning, forming arcs of careful observation, resilience, and quiet persistence. Silence filled the spaces between, carrying memory, reflection, and the delicate pulse of life. Budapest had endured, but at the cost of its soul. The city moved slowly, carrying in its stones and silence the weight of countless lives lost. Streets once filled with laughter, now held only the soft echoes of absence. Hushed and deliberate, mass graves and hidden corners held memory beneath the earth, subtle reminders of what the siege had claimed. Survivors walked quietly, pausing to touch walls, rubble, and fragments of homes, tracing presence with gentle hands. Footsteps fell softly on broken stone, blending with the hush of snow and wind. Fires glimmered in scattered locations, offering faint warmth and a quiet acknowledgement of those who remained. Children learned slowly, observing gestures, pauses, and subtle rhythms that spoke of endurance and memory. The Danube flowed beneath bridges, calm and impartial, carrying reflection along its frozen surface. Windows reflected faint light and shadow, showing traces of life against the stillness. The silence of the dead became the loudest memory of all. Every corner of the city bore witness to absence, yet carried whispers of presence once known. Soldiers and civilians moved with deliberate care, tracing paths through rubble and shadow, soft arcs of observation. Fires flickered gently, illuminating corners and doorways with muted light. Footsteps traced arcs across fractured stone, leaving faint echoes in alleys and courtyards. Snow softened edges, blending shadow with texture, silence with subtle movement. Children followed closely, observing the careful pace and absorbing the rhythm of reflection. The Danube flowed steadily beneath, indifferent yet constant, reflecting pale light and shadowed ruins. Windows offered quiet glimpses of warmth, human presence and perseverance. Silence seemed heavy yet tender, holding the weight of memory and endurance. The silence of the dead became the loudest memory of all. The remnants of buildings and homes formed quiet monuments to lives that once flourished. Survivors paused, tracing paths through alleys and courtyards, each step careful, each pause intentional. Fires glimmered low, casting soft light that touched walls, rubble, and the faint traces of human presence. Footsteps echoed gently across stone, merging with wind, snow, and quiet observation. Children pressed close to guardians, learning patience, observation, and the subtle language of endurance. The Danube flowed beneath shattered bridges, calm and impartial, carrying reflection and memory alike. Windows held traces of warmth, subtle movement, and fragile life. Even silence seemed meaningful, framing absence with quiet contemplative presence. Every gesture, step, and pause contributed to the rhythm of remembrance. The silence of the dead became the loudest memory of all. Mass graves, unmarked or gently tended, held stories beneath the frozen earth. Soft and enduring, survivors moved with reverence, tracing arcs of careful exploration through streets and courtyards. Fires glimmered faintly, offering warmth and low illumination across frozen surfaces. Footsteps echoed softly, merging presence with reflection, memory with endurance. Snow reflected pale light, softening edges and muffling distant sound. Children observed, learning the rhythm of careful movement and the silent language of memory. The Danube flowed steadily, constant and impartial, reflecting muted light and shadowed forms. Windows offered faint glimpses of warmth and presence, subtle acknowledgement of fragile life. Silence seemed active, holding weight, memory, and quiet witness. The silence of the dead became the loudest memory of all. Even streets far from the river carried traces of those who had vanished, absent yet present in memory. Footsteps traced soft paths across broken stone and fractured courtyards, careful, deliberate, and reverent. Fires flickered low, illuminating corners, thresholds, and hidden places with gentle light. Snow softened edges of ruins, blending shadow and structure, absence and subtle presence. Children pressed close, observing the rhythm of movement, learning patience and reflection. The Danube flowed beneath ice and fractured bridges, indifferent yet steady, carrying faint reflections of light and shadow. Windows reflected quiet life and traces of warmth, subtle markers of continuity amid silence. Every pause, gesture, and step held meaning, forming arcs of memory, observation, and gentle endurance. Silence carried the weight of what was lost, yet allowed space for careful remembrance. The silence of the dead became the loudest memory of all. Twilight spread gently across rooftops, rubble, and empty streets, painting shadow and stone with muted winter hues. Survivors traced deliberate paths through fractured avenues, observing and reflecting with soft attention. Fires glimmered low, illuminating corners and interiors, subtle beacons of warmth and life. Footsteps echoed gently across stone and debris, carrying the rhythm of careful movement and reflection. Snow reflected pale light, merging shadow and form, softening the city's absence. Children absorbed each gesture and pause, learning patience, observation, and the quiet language of endurance. The Danube flowed steadily below, constant and impartial, reflecting muted light and shadowed remnants. Windows offered faint glimpses of warmth, continuity, and careful presence. Silence settled over the city, holding memory, reflection, and subtle endurance in its folds. The silence of the dead became the loudest memory of all. Evening deepened, and the city's soft shadows stretched long across fractured streets and alleys. Survivors moved slowly, tracing arcs of careful exploration through neighborhoods that had become landscapes of absence. Fires glimmered faintly, illuminating thresholds, corners, and small pockets of warmth. Footsteps echoed softly on broken pavements, carrying presence, memory, and quiet reflection. Snow softened distant sound, emphasizing hushed spaces and muted patterns of movement. Children observed every gesture, learning the rhythm of patient endurance and subtle observation. The Danube flowed beneath shattered bridges, constant, calm, and indifferent, reflecting muted light along its quiet course. Windows held faint reflections of warmth and human continuity, subtle markers of resilience. Silence seemed alive, carrying weight, memory, and gentle witness across the sleeping city. The silence of the dead became the loudest memory of all. By night, Budapest rested in quiet shadow, streets blanketed with snow, ash, and soft remembrance. Footsteps traced slow arcs through fractured alleys, deliberate, careful, and contemplative. Fires glimmered low, offering subtle warmth and gentle light in scattered corners. Shadows stretched softly across walls and rubble, merging presence with memory, life with absence. Children pressed close to guardians, absorbing the rhythm of careful motion, observation, and endurance. The Danube flowed steadily beneath frozen bridges, calm, impartial, carrying reflection and memory alike. Windows revealed faint traces of warmth, subtle presence, and fragile continuity. Every gesture, step, and pause held meaning, forming delicate arcs of remembrance, quiet endurance, and reflection. Silence filled the city, carrying memory, reflection, and the weight of human presence alongside absence. The silence of the dead became the loudest memory of all. The streets of Budapest lay quiet, still bearing the marks of a city that had endured both storm and shadow. Soldiers, weary and silent, moved through alleys and courtyards, tracing paths shaped by memory and necessity. Fires glimmered faintly, offering warmth to those who lingered among the rubble. Soft arcs of light against cold stone. Footsteps fell carefully across broken pavements, echoing gently into empty corners and frozen courtyards. Snow reflected pale light across fractured rooftops, softening shadow and ash into muted patterns. Children observed quietly, holding hands, learning the rhythm of careful movement, endurance, and reflection. The Danube flowed steadily beneath ruined bridges, indifferent, constant, carrying reflections of the past along its frozen course. Windows offered subtle traces of warmth and human presence, gentle markers of continuity amid absence. Even silence seemed deliberate, framing the city's presence in soft arcs of observation. From the ruins of Budapest, the road to Berlin was suddenly clear. The fall of the city marked a quiet yet profound turning point, a subtle shift in the balance of power across Europe. German forces, once formidable, had yielded to relentless pressure, leaving roads, rails, and bridges as silent witnesses to collapse. Soldiers traced their retreat with careful steps, aware of absence, loss, and the fragile lines of survival. Civilians emerged cautiously, touching familiar walls, door frames, and corners that had survived the storm. Fires glimmered low, casting soft warmth across empty courtyards and streets. Footsteps echoed across fractured stone, deliberate and reflective, carrying both memory and anticipation. Snow blended shadow and form, muting the harshness of destruction and emphasizing the quiet rhythm of endurance. Children pressed close to guardians, learning the rhythm of patient observation and subtle reflection. The Danube flowed beneath ruined bridges, calm and impartial, reflecting soft light and shadowed remnants. From the ruins of Budapest, the road to Berlin was suddenly clear. The city's scars were vast, yet each path traced by survivors spoke of resilience, observation, and the gentle pulse of life persisting. Soldiers and civilians moved carefully, following arcs of safety, memory, and quiet curiosity. Fires glimmered faintly, illuminating corners, thresholds, and fragile signs of continued human presence. Footsteps traced measured lines across rubble and frozen streets, merging with snow, wind, and the hush of quiet reflection. Shadows stretched softly across fractured walls, blending form, memory, and gentle endurance. Children absorbed the rhythm of careful movement, observing every pause, gesture, and subtle shift in light. The Danube flowed steadily below, calm, impartial, reflecting muted light and shadowed traces of history. Windows reflected faint warmth and continuity, subtle markers of fragile persistence. Silence carried meaning, holding memory, observation, and quiet resilience within its folds. From the ruins of Budapest, the road to Berlin was suddenly clear. Paths leading from the city traced arcs of transition, linking fractured streets with distant horizons. Soldiers and civilians navigated carefully, aware of absence, observing subtle signs of life and shadow. Fires flickered low, offering warmth, comfort, and small markers of continuity. Footsteps traced deliberate lines through courtyards and streets, echoing softly against broken stone. Snow softened edges and muted sound, blending presence and absence in gentle patterns. Children pressed close, learning patience, observation, and the quiet rhythm of survival. The Danube flowed beneath shattered bridges, calm and steady, reflecting pale light and muted shadows. Windows revealed faint signs of warmth, subtle presence, and fragile endurance. Silence seemed active, carrying memory, reflection, and the gentle pulse of persistence across the city. From the ruins of Budapest, the road to Berlin was suddenly clear. The collapse of German command left quiet corridors of movement, subtle and careful, as soldiers traced retreat with measured steps. Streets once bustling now bore only deliberate motion, echoes of reflection, and muted human presence. Fires glimmered faintly, illuminating thresholds, courtyards, and small clusters of survival. Footsteps carried carefully across broken stone, merging with the hush of wind, snow, and stillness. Snow reflected pale light, blending shadow and texture, softening the harsh edges of ruin. Children observed quietly, pressing close to guardians, learning the rhythm of careful motion and observation. The Danube flowed beneath fractured bridges, constant, calm, and impartial, reflecting muted light across its frozen surface. Windows offered subtle glimpses of warmth and presence, delicate markers of continuity and human endurance. Silence held meaning, framing absence and reflection with gentle care. From the ruins of Budapest, the road to Berlin was suddenly clear. Evening settled softly, stretching long shadows across alleys, courtyards, and fractured streets. Survivors moved with deliberate care, tracing paths through rubble, frozen stone, and silent corners. Fires flickered low, offering warmth and subtle illumination to pockets of endurance and quiet life. Footsteps traced gentle arcs across stone and debris, merging movement, reflection, and soft observation. Snow softened edges, blending shadow and form into muted patterns of presence and absence. Children pressed close, learning patience, observation, and the quiet rhythm of survival. The Danube flowed below, calm and indifferent, reflecting pale light and shadowed outlines. Windows held faint traces of warmth, subtle presence, and fragile continuity. Silence carried both weight and gentleness, framing the subtle arcs of life that persisted. From the ruins of Budapest, the road to Berlin was suddenly clear. Night deepened, and the city exhaled into quiet, carrying the soft residue of memory, endurance, and presence. Footsteps traced careful arcs through fractured streets, deliberate and reflective, merging past and present. Fires glimmered faintly, illuminating corners, doorways, and small traces of human life. Shadows shifted gently across walls and rubble, blending presence, memory, and subtle endurance. Snow reflected pale light, softening edges, muffling distant sound, and creating a hushed rhythm across empty streets. Children observed, pressing close to guardians, absorbing the quiet lessons of patience and reflection. The Danube flowed beneath ruined bridges, calm, constant, and impartial, reflecting soft light and shadowed traces of history. Windows revealed faint warmth and subtle human presence, delicate markers of persistence. Silence seemed full, holding memory, reflection, and quiet anticipation of what lay ahead. From the ruins of Budapest, the road to Berlin was suddenly clear. By midnight, the city rested in gentle shadow, streets blanketed with snow, ash, and quiet remembrance. Footsteps moved slowly, deliberate, soft, marking paths through fractured alleys and courtyards. Fires flickered low, offering warmth, gentle light, and subtle comfort. Shadows stretched across rubble, blending presence with memory and soft endurance. Children pressed close to guardians, observing, absorbing, and learning the rhythm of careful movement. The Danube flowed steadily beneath shattered bridges, constant, calm, indifferent, reflecting muted light and quiet traces of history. Windows held faint traces of warmth, human presence, and fragile continuity. Every step, gesture, and pause contributed to the soft pulse of observation, memory, and endurance. Silence filled the city, holding weight, reflection, and the gentle promise of the path forward. From the ruins of Budapest, the road to Berlin was suddenly clear. The city breathed slowly, carrying in its stones, streets, and bridges the quiet memory of a long night that had passed. Survivors walked softly, tracing paths through alleys and courtyards once fractured, now settling into delicate rhythm. Fires glimmered faintly, low and gentle, illuminating thresholds, windows, and fragile corners of continued life. Footsteps fell softly on pavements smoothed by snow and time, echoing with patience and reflection. The Danube flowed steadily beneath the city, constant and impartial, reflecting pale light across water and stone. Children wandered cautiously, learning the rhythm of quiet movement, observation, and endurance. Buildings rose slowly from ruins, brick by brick, shadow by shadow, their outlines softened by reflection and memory. Windows offered faint signs of warmth, continuity, and human presence that had survived the storm. The city itself seemed to inhale slowly, holding space for remembrance, reflection, and renewal. The Danube flows on, carrying the memories of a city that fell, rose, and remembered. Bridges, some rebuilt and some resting in memory alone, spanned the Danube with gentle arches, tracing lines of connection and history. Survivors moved along these paths with careful steps, observing both scars and signs of renewal. Fires flickered low, soft beacons of warmth and human presence across streets that had once been hollow. Footsteps echoed against stone and pavement, deliberate, careful, merging with wind and the gentle hush of the city. Snow and rain softened edges, blurring shadow and light into muted patterns of reflection. Children watched quietly, absorbing lessons of endurance and subtle observation from those who had lived through silence and absence. The Danube flowed calmly below, carrying light, shadow, and memory in equal measure. Windows revealed small glimmers of warmth, subtle markers of life resuming its quiet rhythm. Silence held a gentle weight, framing presence, memory, and the soft pulse of recovery. The Danube flows on, carrying the memories of a city that fell, rose, and remembered. In parks, courtyards, and quiet squares, memorials rose slowly, etched with names, dates, and subtle arcs of remembrance. Footsteps traced gentle paths around them, deliberate and reflective, carrying the rhythm of observation and reverence. Fires glimmered faintly in small clusters, offering warmth and light across snow-dusted stone. Shadows stretched softly across walls and cobblestones, merging memory with presence and gentle endurance. Children lingered near older figures, observing gestures, pauses, and soft routines that spoke of continuity. The Danube flowed steadily, calm and impartial, reflecting muted light across its frozen or rippling surface. Windows glimmered with subtle warmth, delicate traces of persistence and quiet life. Silence seemed active, holding memory, reflection, and the slow rhythm of healing within its folds. Every gesture, step, and pause carried significance, forming arcs of remembrance and quiet resilience. The Danube flows on, carrying the memories of a city that fell, rose, and remembered. Streets once scarred by ruin now held traces of delicate renewal, subtle marks of human perseverance. Survivors moved slowly, tracing paths through courtyards, parks, and quiet lanes that had witnessed so much. Fires glimmered faintly in hearths and corners, soft warmth against cold stone and air. Footsteps echoed gently across pavement, merging presence with reflection, shadow with muted light. Children observed carefully, absorbing quiet rhythms of endurance, observation, and careful movement. The Danube flowed beneath rebuilt and remembered bridges, constant, calm, carrying reflection and memory alike. Windows reflected faint warmth and subtle traces of human presence, delicate markers of life continuing. Silence carried the weight of absence, memory, and soft endurance, framing gentle arcs of reflection. Even shadows seemed alive, holding space for thought, memory, and quiet reverence. The Danube flows on, carrying the memories of a city that fell, rose, and remembered. Courtyards, gardens, and parks held echoes of footsteps, laughter, and whispers from years past, now tempered by reflection. Survivors moved with deliberate care, tracing paths along stone, ash, and soft snow, observing subtle signs of life. Fires glimmered low, casting gentle warmth and muted light across corners of endurance and quiet habitation. Footsteps traced deliberate arcs, soft and reflective, merging memory with observation and quiet rhythm. Children pressed close, learning patience, observation, and subtle signs of human continuity. The Danube flowed beneath bridges old and new, calm and steady, carrying soft reflections of light, shadow, and history. Windows offered subtle glimmers of warmth and life, markers of persistence across quiet streets. Silence seemed deliberate, holding memory, reflection, and soft endurance in its folds. Every gesture, step, and pause contributed to the delicate pulse of the city's quiet recovery. The Danube flows on, carrying the memories of a city that fell, rose, and remembered. Along riverbanks and quiet avenues, survivors paused to touch stone, water, and the subtle remnants of memory. Footsteps carried softly, careful and deliberate, blending past and present into quiet arcs of observation. Fires glimmered faintly, offering warmth, soft illumination, and gentle comfort. Shadows stretched across walls, bridges, and streets, merging presence, memory, and subtle resilience. Snow and wind softened edges, muffling distant sounds and emphasizing the gentle rhythm of recovery. Children lingered close, learning through observation and the quiet repetition of movement. The Danube flowed steadily, impartial and calm, carrying light, shadow, and subtle traces of history. Windows glimmered with faint warmth and subtle life, markers of enduring continuity. Silence held presence, memory, and gentle endurance, framing a city learning again to breathe. The Danube flows on, carrying the memories of a city that fell, rose, and remembered. Twilight softened streets, rooftops, and courtyards, blending shadow and light into gentle patterns of reflection. Survivors moved slowly, tracing arcs across paths shaped by endurance and memory. Fires glimmered low, illuminating thresholds, corners, and the faint traces of life that remained. Footsteps echoed softly, deliberate and reflective, merging with wind, snow, and muted light. Children pressed close, observing every gesture, pause, and subtle lesson in careful continuity. The Danube flowed beneath bridges, constant, calm, and impartial, reflecting pale light and shadowed traces of history. Windows revealed faint warmth and subtle human presence, gentle reminders of continuity. Silence carried weight, reflection, and gentle endurance, holding memory in delicate balance. Every gesture, every step, every pause traced the quiet rhythm of survival and remembrance. The Danube flows on, carrying the memories of a city that fell, rose, and remembered. By night, Budapest rested beneath gentle shadows, streets blanketed in snow, memory, and quiet reverence. Footsteps moved slowly, careful, deliberate, tracing arcs across alleys, courtyards, and fragile traces of endurance. Fires glimmered low, offering warmth and muted light to corners, thresholds, and small pockets of life. Shadows stretched softly across streets, blending past and present, memory and quiet resilience. Children pressed close, observing, absorbing, and learning the subtle rhythm of continuity. The Danube flowed steadily beneath bridges, constant, calm, carrying muted reflections of history, memory, and survival. Windows held faint traces of warmth, subtle presence, and fragile continuity, delicate markers of life resuming its course. Silence held the city, framing reflection, endurance, and quiet observation within its folds. Even the wind seemed attentive, carrying whispers of memory along the river and through streets now calm. The Danube flows on, carrying the memories of a city that fell, rose, and remembered.